Hey, welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and I got food poisoning from a tilapia. So here are some terrifying stories about witches that I've read over the years in one big ol' oddly handsome compilation. I mean, why is it so handsome? Anyway, enjoy and be sure to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them, you silly goober. Also, be sure to follow and review Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Now, let's begin. The Witch of Donner Farm. From Harsh Truth. In the 1980s, when I was around 7 or 8 years old, my dad's dad died. He'd lost a long-fought battle against cancer. I hate to say it like this, but I remember my family feeling relieved. The stress and pain my grandfather suffered was finally over. Now, my grandfather had been a man who saved his money, but never came around to spending it. And as my grandmother had long since passed, my father received everything from his father's will. My family received over $60,000 in the will, and after some time planning and discussing with my mother, my dad decided to put it towards his dream home. He wanted to return to the country lifestyle he grew up in. He thought the fields and woods would be a better place to raise my older brother and I. Soon my parents purchased a beautiful ranch-style home with 80 acres of land, much of which still had to be financed, but the inheritance did cover most of it. I remember when I first walked through the doorway of my childhood home. It smelled of well-kept wood, the scent of freshly cut grass wafting in from the open front door. My mother left it up to my brother and I to decide between ourselves which rooms were ours. This would be my first time having a room to myself. I was so excited that I didn't care much which room my brother picked. I wish I would have cared, though. I ended up with the room furthest from my parents' room. This room was sizable, with 2 windows overlooking the fields outside. It also had a big closet that I had no idea what to do with. A lot of space for a boy who kept his clothes in a dresser. It was on the very first day we were there when the strange occurrences began. Having told our parents which rooms we decided on, we started to unpack separately in our rooms. I was sitting in the back corner of the closet of my room, figuring out how to stack my collection of board games, the only things I could think of to place in there at the time. I'd left my closet door open, as well as my bedroom door, so that lights from the house and from outside would shine into the closet. The closet did have its own light source, one of those light bulbs with a pull string, but I had a lot of trouble reaching it, so I didn't want to bother with it. I recall having just set down my Monopoly box when the closet door slammed shut. Instantly, I shot up and turned around. Without any light from the outside, the closet was pitch black, save for the narrow crack under the door. Uneasy, I called out my brother's name, assuming he was joking with me. There was no reply. I ran toward the door using the crack of light at the bottom as my guide. Then I scoured the dark for the doorknob. Relief filled me when I found it, until I tried to turn it. It wouldn't budge. It didn't make sense. The closet door didn't have a lock on the inside or outside of it. Why wouldn't it turn? A scared child, I could only assume my older brother was on the other side holding the doorknob still. We liked to joke with each other as all brothers do, but he had never been one to prank me like this. He was as much scared of the dark as I was. Moments after realizing trying to open the door was futile, I turned back toward the center of the closet and reached my hand upward, looking for the string to the light, or rather feeling for it. It was difficult for me to reach, but I knew if I could just feel the tip, I could jump up and yank it down, and the darkness would disappear. The longer I stepped blindly through the dark, the faster my heart pounded. Being engulfed in darkness was a nightmare come true. Little did I know things would get worse. I did finally feel the small caplet at the end of the string. Before I could jump up and attempt to yank the cord down, I felt something that took my breath away. An icy cold hand. From behind me, it placed itself on my neck and slowly ran up my cheek. I jumped and screamed so loud some of the blood vessels in my face busted. I practically tackled the wall next to me to get around the thing that had touched me, because it had come from the direction of the door. Quickly, I scuttled toward the door and began to pound against it, screaming for anyone that might hear me. Moments later, my dad pulled the door open from the other side. I nearly fell on my face. I crawled out and immediately looked back into the closet. The darkness now cowered away from the light that flowed back through the open door. The closet, except for my board game stack in the back, was empty. My dad picked me up and embraced me and looked at my face. Buddy, did you lock yourself in there? Jeez, look at your face." He wiped tears away from my red cheeks. As he carried me to his and my mom's room to comfort me, I couldn't bring myself to tell him that the door didn't have a lock. But I did manage to tell both of them what happened in there. But they blamed it on my intense fear of the dark. Specifically, my mom said being that scared can make you see or feel things that aren't there. She compared it to seeing figures or faces in the dark, when what you're actually looking at is a coat rack or a chair. As much as I loved my parents, I did not agree with a word of what they said. The hand I'd felt so long ago there was vividly real, and I remember it clearly even now. That hand was not my own, nor was it my imagination. Later on, when Dad went to my closet one night to grab one of my board games, I watched him do a double take when he opened the door. It was the first time he'd actually taken a look at it. My dad looked the doorknob over on both sides and raised an eyebrow. "Hey, buddy," he said as he checked out the closet door. "If you go in here, make sure you don't close the door or you might get stuck in there again. There's no lock, so it's probably just warped or something." I nodded and did my best to believe him. Over the next few months, small but weird and creepy things would happen, particularly in that part of the house towards my room. Dirty clothes I'd lay in the bedroom floor would often wind up inside the closet floor the next morning. When I began closing the closet door every night out of fear of the darned thing, it would always be open in the morning. One day when I was out playing after having cleaned my room, my mom called me back inside, absolutely furious. When I went back inside to my room where my mom was, she was fuming because of how trashed my room had become. She thought I hadn't cleaned it, but the state it was suddenly in was worse than I'd ever seen it before. Every drawer in my dresser had been pulled out and dumped out. My blanket and sheet from my bed had been pulled off and tossed over the closet door, which was now open. And inside the closet were hundreds of board game pieces, as someone had dumped each of the boxes out onto the floor. I was flabbergasted, but no matter what I said to my mom, she wasn't having it. She demanded I clean my room properly before I was allowed to come out of the room. Obviously, I was upset, but I did as she said. I cleaned as fast as I could, folded all my clothes again, remade my bed, then stood at the opening to my closet. I couldn't bring myself to walk in there alone, especially after something or someone had just ruined my room, and I know it wasn't me or my brother, because we'd been outside, and why would my parents mess up my room? Deep down, I knew it was the thing in the closet. I stayed in that room 2 hours longer than I had to, unwilling to enter that closet to pick up the board game pieces. But when my stomach began to growl, and the smell of homemade fried chicken filled the air, I forced myself up and into the closet. It took me a few tries, but I managed to jump up and catch the string to the light bulb, so at least I'd have some light if I did get stuck in there again. Quickly, I started to pick up the pieces on the floor. It was a pain matching them up with the right boxes, as about a dozen different games had been mixed up. Every few seconds I glanced at the closet door, making sure it stayed open. I thought nothing would happen if that door was open. I thought nothing could happen if the light was on. I was wrong. I picked up the final piece eventually, a small white ball that I'm pretty sure belonged in the Hungry Hungry Hippos box. I threw it in, closed up the box, and turned around. I stopped. A woman stood in the doorway. Her feminine shape made me first think it was my mother, but she was taller than my mother. Her hair was a mess and went down to her ribs. She stood facing away from me in a stained but light blue dress. She appeared to be looking out the windows of my bedroom. My voice failed me. I wanted to speak to her, but I had no idea what to say. I wanted to think it was some long-lost relative coming for a visit that I'd never met before, and I hadn't known was coming. Denial is a powerful thing. The woman breathed in and out so slowly that I didn't hear her first breath until long after I studied her. Her breath was extremely slow and troubled, as if she'd been a smoker for multiple lifetimes. Then she lifted a bony finger and pointed towards one of the windows. I swear I heard her speak then. I think she said, "Such a nice day." Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, my vision was obstructed. I flinched away, first thinking that I'd suddenly gone blind, but as my hands felt up towards my face, I found greasy, messy hair covering my small form. Then, that slow, struggling breathing came from behind me. This woman was no longer in the doorway. She stood right behind me, with her hair draped over me. I screamed then, and I ran forward, where I last saw the open closet door. And Christ, this sounds crazy, but the few feet I ran to escape that closet, each inch of the way I floundered through that hair. Her breathing stayed in the same spot in the closet, but the hair seemed infinite, as if it no longer came from her head, and instead hung from the ceiling. Only when I burst out of the closet did the hair finally come to an end. I turned to shut the door and found once again the closet empty. These are a couple of my most terrifying experiences with what I would eventually refer to as the Witch of Donner Farm. Donner was the name of one of the previous owners of the land. I wish I could say I figured out who she was, that we moved, that it all stopped, but we didn't move, and it never did stop. It would happen randomly and things might calm down for months at a time, but she was always there, seemingly preferring my side of the house. The experiences only stopped after I moved out at the age of 20. If you want to hear more of these experiences, let me know. I'm sure most of you won't believe me. I wish I could sleep a bit better at night. The Witches in the Texas Woods, from Skip McGrip 3. I live in the downtown area of a major Texas city. To get away from the city and enjoy the outdoors and some alone time, I would make the hour-and-a-half drive almost every weekend to a small cabin that my folks have in the woods. I've been hanging out at that cabin in those woods almost my entire life, so I felt pretty comfortable there. The area doesn't have many people living there and it's relatively safe. So one weekend I took some of my friends out there to fish and spend some time away from the city. While fishing on the bank of the river that runs near my folks' cabin, we pulled up some chairs, started a fire, drank a few beers, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. That's the good stuff right there. After sitting around for a few hours, I suggested we go hunting the next morning for breakfast. The guys weren't big fans of the idea of waking up early to crawl around in the woods looking for something to eat. They would have rather stayed up all night drinking and fishing, and wake up late the next day. "Let's just go hunting now," said one of them. Everyone else agreed and started getting rowdy. I stayed put in my chair and replied, No, it's too late. It's too dark. We wouldn't be able to see a thing out there, man. Plus, those dang witches." Everyone knew I made a good point, but then one of them said, "Whoa, wait, what do you mean witches? What are witches anyway, like really?" I laughed a bit because they all seemed so intrigued, and all of a sudden so focused. So I began telling the story of the last time I went camping and hunting in the woods around my parents' cabin. It was just like any other camping hunting trip I'd gone out on. I'd packed a backpack with all the necessities, a .22 long rifle, and an M&P 45 that I always carry. I parked my truck at my folks' and walked down the dirt road until it disappeared into the woods. I make a point to not overhunt in any one area, so I hiked in a direction I knew I'd never hunted in. After a few hours of hiking, I found a good clearing in the woods that would have allowed for a good amount of moonlight once it got dark. I don't use a tent when I camp alone, so setting up my camp was fairly easy. I got a fire going, and I hurried off to find some small game for dinner before it got too dark. After bagging a few squirrels and a rabbit, I started to head back to my campsite. The night had already started to settle in, so it was getting quite dark on me. I took a moment to light my lantern that was hanging off my backpack. I poured some lantern oil in it and lit it. A few hundred yards later, I heard movement in the distance. Obviously, while moving through the woods with a backpack with a rifle strapped to it, you make a lot of noise yourself. However, the noises that came from deeper in the trees have a distinct sound, like an echo or a reverberation. So when I heard movement coming from somewhere else other than myself, I froze, staying completely still and listening. There was nothing. My brain started reasoning as fast as it could, and concluded that a branch might have fallen, or a deer got spooked and hightailed it out of the area. That was good enough for me. So I continued on through the dark in the direction I knew my campsite was. Compasses don't lie, and I'd learned how to use them and rely on them by this point in my life. I heard it again though, noises coming from my right, north of where I was. And this time I almost thought I heard a yell of some kind. Again I froze, thinking, coyotes. I'm not too worried about coyotes, so I continued. The way back was starting to feel really long though. But hiking through the woods during the day is very different than hiking through the woods at night. You usually hike slower, watching your steps more carefully, so it's not unusual that a hike the same distance could take longer at night than during the day. Before I go on, I feel like I should say that I was recently married at the time, probably less than a year at that point. Like I wrote before, I traveled a lot throughout my life, and homesickness was not something I was familiar with until I met my wife. I'll call her Juliet here. We met when we were both 18, and up until then I had never missed my home or anyone really whenever I was away. But once we started dating, I began to finally experience the feeling of being homesick whenever I was away for too long, and in some cases, not long at all. That Friday evening, I left for the woods. I got home from work and sat down with Juliet for dinner before leaving. It had only been a few hours since I last saw Juliet, and yet I missed her so badly in those woods. So much so that I think I almost felt pain. Having said that, I think it'll make what happened next a little more creepy. Anyway, I'd heard something. I froze and I stood still in the dark woods and turned to my right. I was deeply confused because I knew what I just heard. It was Juliet calling me. Although it sounded like she was a bit far, there was no doubt it was Juliet. What's she doing out here? There must be some emergency. I gotta find her. She's probably been calling my phone, and it's not even on. Something bad must have happened, I thought, as my mind raced to rationalize and come up with a realistic conclusion.
Chip! 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 Chip!
She yelled through the trees in the distance. My name isn't Chip, but it's what Juliet calls me, and only Juliet. I basically jogged through the dark forest towards where I last heard her, stopping every now and then to listen for her again. Eventually I had to stop because I had not heard Juliet yell for a while. I stood there quietly panicking for what must have been 5 minutes, but every second was torturous. I felt like I failed to find my wife, to help her. She came all the way out here to find me because she needed me and I couldn't even find my way to her. And then I heard her again.
Chip! 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 Chip!
Her voice quietly resonated through the tall trees, and she sounded like she was in pain. I began to walk as quietly as I could towards her so I could hear her if she called out to me again, and she did. She sounded noticeably closer. I was relieved as I felt myself getting closer and closer to Juliet.
Chip! 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 Chip!
This time I felt alarmed. I felt like I was about to be in danger, but I shook it off and continued toward my wife. Chip, Chip, Chip. Again I heard her calling me, but she didn't sound quite right. It was as if she was in pain, but also like it wasn't her at all. Just like two different people can say the same things in the same pitch and rhythm, but they can never sound exactly like each other. Like there was someone else pretending to be Juliet and mimicking her voice. But I had heard her so clearly just a few moments ago. I figured she was choking up, trying not to cry, so I kept moving. Again and again I heard Juliet calling me as I walked closer and closer. Each time she called, though, her voice sounded less and less like her. By the time she sounded like she was only 10 or so yards away, I was on high alert. It sounded nothing like her by then. Whoever it was calling me, she wanted me to believe she was Juliet, and by then I knew for sure it wasn't her. I approached carefully with my handgun drawn. This person wasn't moving one bit, but I could tell where she was. I walked closer, inch by inch, holding my lantern up in front of me trying to see who I was dealing with. Then, peeking from around a tree, I saw two eyes reflecting the flame from my lamp. I have to admit, at that moment I was terrified. Juliet is shorter than I am, and I was eye to eye with whoever this was, and her eyes were too far apart to have been Juliet's. "Hey, is everything all right?" I asked, like an idiot.
"Jeb,"
she said.
"I can give you anything you want."
I knew right away what she really was. I knew her malicious intentions. "Jesus help me," I said under my breath in a fearful whisper, gun still in my hand, safely aimed toward the ground with my finger off the trigger. As soon as those words left my mouth, she visibly flinched, as if she had smelled something disgusting. I could only tell by her silhouette and the reflections in her eyes, though. I stood still, realizing what I had just said, while she backed away from me, back into darkness. Up until this point during my story, my buddies sat staring at me completely silent, listening to me speak. "Dude, why didn't you just shoot her? You had a gun, right?" said the youngest guy. I told him it would have been useless to shoot the witch. It wouldn't have killed her or even hurt her, probably. "How? Why?" he replied. I began to explain to them what witches really are. People who practice witchcraft and offer rituals to demons they conjure in return for something they want. My theory was that this witch in particular achieved immortality through the sacrifice of people and animals. I could tell they were thinking it over and trying to decide whether to believe me or not. And to those listening, I know y'all might think this is unbelievable, and if I hadn't seen it all before, I wouldn't believe it either. The truth is, my parents were and still are very prominent figures in the church I grew up in. Being elders of the church community, they both performed exorcisms throughout my childhood. And no, I don't mean the stereotypical Hollywood Catholic priest with a little white thing on his neck under a black jacket holding up a wooden cross. They belonged to a Hispanic Protestant denomination that, in fact, thoroughly disagree with and oppose Catholicism. Being too young to stay home alone most of the time, I was often taken with my folks with them on house calls to pull demons out of people. It was a horrible experience every time. In Latin American cultures, it's not uncommon for people and their kids to visit witch doctors or healers when feeling sick, or when they want their lives to move in a better direction, and sometimes when they want harm to come upon someone who has wronged them. Participating in these rituals is like an open invitation for demons and leaves people vulnerable to demonic activity, so there was always someone in need of help in our community. I watched and listened to everything my parents did during exorcisms, and read every book my dad kept in his office about the subject. By the time I had this incident in the woods, I already knew what to do and what not to do very well. I resumed my story after explaining a bit more to my buddies. As I was saying, I stood in the dark forest with my lamp held up with my outstretched arm until I could no longer see or hear the witch backing away. My adrenaline took a while to fully dissipate. Then fear hit me hard. I tried walking back to my campsite steadily and quietly, but my nerves got the best of me, and I ended up almost sprinting through the dark. I was pretty confident I could find my way back, but either way, I checked my compass frequently. Yet, after running and running in the correct direction, I never reached my campsite. I felt confused and doubted myself like never before. Maybe I really don't know anything about being in the woods, I wondered. How could I have gotten myself so lost? I turned around and walked until I saw a familiar pattern in the trees. Once I felt confident about where I was, I forced myself to walk back to where I ran into the witch. When I found the tree she was initially hiding behind, I stared at it for a good while, expecting her to peek around it again, but nothing, thankfully. I retraced my steps back to where I detoured off my path to follow Juliet's voice, and after hiking a bit longer, I found my campsite. I was exhausted, covered in sweat, scratched up, hungry, and humiliated by the woods. I considered packing everything up and starting on the long walk back to the cabin, but I had no energy. I ate and called it a night. I didn't sleep much, even though I felt entirely drained. The woods were very loud that night, even by a summer night's standard. The bugs and animals didn't stop me to take a breath for a second, and the owls were particularly aggressive as well. I could hear them screaming near and far all night. Every time I began to drift off into rest, I would get awakened to the owls' screams echoing in the forest. Or at least, that's what I assumed to be owls. I turned to look at the guys and asked them if they were still down to creep into the woods. They looked at each other and hesitantly said yes, nervously chuckling. "Well, y'all go ahead. I'm not going in there right now," I said, laughing to myself. "But it didn't do anything to you. You scared her away," one of them replied. "Maybe, but only because I said Jesus," I said. "Well, then just say it again if she comes back." He was noticeably irritated. "It's not that simple," I replied. "I think you really have to believe for that to work. And I can say I really did believe back then, but now, I won't be calling on anyone to come help me." After I said that, I don't remember much about that night, other than all of us ending the night by watching Blood Diamond in the cabin. It's the only movie my folks have in there. I think it was already there when they bought the place. As for what I said about believing, I'm not 100% sure it's right. Most demons hate God and Jesus, and I'm not sure if they care if you believe in God or not. It's not that I don't believe in God anymore. However, the only reason I do believe is because I've seen the other side of things. That witch knew what I loved and what I missed, and that I would do anything for Juliet. I've seen and felt evil. but I've never felt God. The Magic Needle Treatment, called Susuk, from J. Ion. As a child, I often accompanied my father to his acupuncture sessions. Because my dad was receiving a specialized acupuncture treatment that required the use of gold-plated needles that were very expensive compared to the regular disposable needles, my dad had his used needles sanitized after every use and stored in a Tupperware container, then brought home to be kept until the next session. It was a regular sight for his container with the gold-plated needles to be placed on the kitchen counter, where my mom usually bakes. Even though I was a child, I knew not to mess with the needles, because it was dangerous, and I knew my father would get very angry if I lost his expensive tools for treatment. There was a time when my grandmother decided to stay for a month with my family. One of those days, she decided to go to the traditional Chinese medicine clinic, where my dad got his acupuncture treatment, to get a consultation and treatment for her weakening general health. As my grandmother and I waited for my father to get ready, I crawled onto the kitchen counter and took the container with the gold-plated needles in it, and I started shaking it like a tambourine out of boredom. My grandmother saw through the semi-transparent lid of the container and remarked at how fine those needles were. This is when she, being descended from a long line of powerful shamans in the superstitious, rural villages of Thailand, started telling me about Susuk, or colloquially known as the magical needle treatment. According to her, very fine and small needles will be placed deep into the facial muscles and skull of a person who seeks beauty, fame, and fortune from a witch doctor. The needles are not inserted physically, but magically, as in the witch doctor has to perform a ritual to make spirits, typically evil ones, bound by black magic, to materialize these tiny needles deep within the face of the person, without puncturing the skin at all. Apparently this Susuk, or magical needle treatment, was very popular among aspiring artists and tycoon wannabes who want the easy and fast way to stardom and success. Me and my child brain couldn't comprehend the idea of having needles anywhere on the head, or the concept of black magic. I remember asking her repeatedly, "Isn't it painful? Why do they do it? Can't they feel it?" She explained that women used it to make themselves irresistibly beautiful, and men would use it to make themselves rich and powerful. As a child, I couldn't wrap my head around the logic and logistics of doing such a procedure. I remember thinking that my grandmother was a nutter, because there was no way anyone could do something so awful to themselves and instantly become beautiful, wealthy, powerful, famous, or successful. It sounded a lot like those endings in fairy tales, where everyone lives happily ever after, immediately at the conclusion of the worst time of their lives. I didn't think much of the story that my grandmother told me until I stumbled across a movie based on this Susuk many years later. A relative of mine bought several DVDs of supernatural horror films to watch during the long holidays, one of them being a movie based on the practice. The movie was actually titled Susuk. This piqued my interest because the memory of what my grandmother told me resurfaced. However, she'd been dead for several years at that point, so I couldn't ask her without the utilization of a Ouija board or a psychic. So I turned to good old Google to find out more. Turns out Susuk wasn't as straightforward and clean-cut as the brief story my grandmother told me. Other than the hefty fee and expensive offerings to be given to the witch doctor, the procedure itself was an unstable one, where if the witch doctor was not well trained and incompetent, it could be botched so badly that the life of the person requesting the magical needle treatment will be taken by the very same spirits meant to endow that person with unnatural charm and riches. Even in the case of a successful Susuk application, the newly seductive or fortuitous person has to observe very strict rules to maintain the efficiency of the black magic. These rules include never putting anything pointy in the mouth, never crossing a body of water, do not prick or injure any part of the skin, avoid sacred places and sharp objects, including broken glass and ceramics, must not be out of home on certain days of the month, and never reveal the true names of people and places involved in the procedure. Those who request for plenty of enhancements, where they desire more than just beauty or wealth, must offer more to the witch doctor and the spirits maintaining the black magic, sometimes even blood sacrifices on a regular basis. Death for those with susuk is extremely painful and slow, especially for those who have been fatally wounded or gravely ill, because the spirits bound by black magic will not let the soul leave the body until they have been appeased and freed by the witch doctor. So those who do not remove their susuk on their deathbeds will be in very drawn-out agony, even literally skinned and disemboweled, yet still miraculously alive and enduring every moment in a lucid manner. I, for one, will never take part in any practice of black magic. From the stories my grandmother told me of her childhood filled with supernatural encounters, dark desires of humans, battles between good and evil, I know for a fact that some things in some places are not meant for mere mortals. The Witch of the Towpath, submitted by Metalhead1. Let me start off by saying I've never really held stock in anything ghost or paranormal related. I guess I'm an atheist at my roots, and I love science and logic. But one dark night in my hometown of Williamsport, Maryland, changed the way I think completely. It happened nearly 10 years ago, when I was 16 going on 17 in my hometown. It was one of those places like everybody knows everybody. Not a lot of crime, hardly any violence, beyond the occasional bar fight that ended up in the streets. All that being said, I loved it there. It was peaceful, serene. I moved away though after I graduated high school, and still miss it to this day. Anyway, at the time my girlfriend and I had just broken up. It was a pretty bad and ugly breakup. I was saddened and angry. I had been very much in love with that girl. But breakups happen. Even as a knucklehead teen, I knew this, but I felt distant. I suddenly felt distant from everyone and everything. I wanted to be alone completely. So I told my folks I was going to one of my many close-knit friends. It was a lie though. I had no intention to do that. So I walked to the towpath that wasn't far from my house. The walk was always relaxing and therapeutic. Walking the towpath, I admired nature and the river nearby. All of it became even more gorgeous during sunset. It really helped me calm down and helped me think better. I keep walking through the towpath a good ways in, and there's not a soul in sight that night. It was getting pretty dark, but I had no care in the world. Not with me being emotional at the time. At one point I sat down, stewing in my emotions and contemplating how I lost her. I'm man enough to admit I cried a little too. As I'm sitting there in the near darkness, completely alone, I suddenly felt the sensation. That cliched feeling people always say they have. It's a real thing. Like someone is watching you nearby. Someone you can't see, but you know they're there. I've read this phrase many times before, but never did I believe that it actually happened. Yet there I sat, with absolutely no fear in my heart, when something put me on edge. I felt chills and goosebumps. I stayed quiet for a while, steadying my breathing to listen, and that's when I heard a rustling in the leaves, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. Right away I assumed it was a bear. It sounded heavier than the smaller animals, like squirrels or raccoons, so that's what I assumed it was. But bears are pretty rare around these parts. Still, I wasn't about to take a chance with that. I just thought I'd get out of there. I began to steadily jog away. Then I began to convince myself that I'm just imagining things. I slowed down back to a walk, and I laughed to myself, thinking about how silly I'm being. When I hear this out of nowhere, "Leave now!" My goosebumps and chills return tenfold as I spin around, facing where the sound had come from. Keep in mind at this point, it's completely dark out, not pitch black, but enough to be pretty eerie. And then I see her. Not too far from me, there's a silhouette of a woman. She's hard to see, as she appears to be wearing all black. My heart sank, and for the first time in my life, I felt like my life was in danger. The woman raised one spindly hand towards me and reached out her finger, a bony, withered finger. I wasn't welcome there, and I knew if I didn't listen to this scary woman, she was going to do something unthinkable to me. Without even knowing it, perhaps by instinct, my eyes were searching for her face, and they found it. She was wrinkly and thin. Half of her teeth were gone, and where her eyes should have been were empty sockets. I snapped myself out of the paralysis, and I bolted out of there as fast as I could. All those years of sports finally paying off for something important. I exerted every muscle I had, afraid that if I didn't get away from this woman, I wouldn't be alive any longer. After maybe 20 yards of running, I turned behind me, fully expecting her to be gone or away from me. But somehow, she was closer than before, still pointing, but motionless. It was like she was gliding towards me. That's impossible. I turned away again, facing ahead of me. I could see the end of the towpath. I closed my eyes and sprinted until I felt the gravel just before you get to the bridge. I opened my eyes. The bridge was so close, yet so far. Again, rather hesitant this time, I turned around to look at the woman, and immediately I felt tons of relief. She was further away now, but still gliding toward me. This time I couldn't take my eyes off of her, off of the danger that was approaching, but I kept running, not even looking where I was going. And right before my eyes, she seemed to evaporate. Like smoke in the wind, she was just gone. But I'm not nearly done running. I run all the way to my friend's house, the nearest place I felt safe at, and I frantically try to tell them and his dad what I just experienced. Of course, my friend was skeptical and even laughed at me, but for some odd reason, his father took me seriously and believed every word. It turns out, his father has seen the witch of the Towpath himself. That's the name he gave her. He claims it's a specter of an old witch that died there, and that to this day, she haunts the Towpath and will chase anyone away who gets too close. I don't know, I'm still torn about what I saw. I don't know what it was, but the way it moved was inhuman. The way it looked was inhuman. Maybe it really was a witch, or maybe it was my grief-filled mind hallucinating something terrifying. I don't think I'll ever know. The Witch Played with Mud. Submitted by Jose. This happened to my dad a long time ago. He was about 10 years old. He and his brother Sergio were out in the fields of Michoacan, feeding the cattle with his father. He said after a long day, they would go to the lake where the water was drinkable, and they would clean themselves, because after a hard day, it was nice to drink fresh water and get clean. The sun was beginning to set at that time, and my dad asked if he and his brother, who was 9 years old at the time, if it was time to go to the lake. After 30 minutes of walking, they arrived. Everything was quiet enough that you could hear only his toes moving on top of the grass. He found the silence odd, but he continued to the water to get a drink with his brother. As they gulped cups of water from their hands, they saw a reflection below them. Immediately, the two boys felt shock, and my father recalls his face going white as they saw a woman in the reflection. She sat atop a boulder behind them in a white gown, and she had jet black hair. They couldn't make out her face, but she was sitting there on the rock, making round circular-shaped mud balls with her hands. Suddenly, his brother slapped the water in fear, forcing the reflective image to be nothing but ripples. The two of them backed away from the water and turned around, to see their dad facing the woman on the boulder. With the mud ball in her thin hand, she said to the two boys,
"Ay, mis hijos,"
which means, "Oh, my children." Right away, my dad grabbed my Uncle Sergio, who was still in shock at the sight of the woman, and together they ran back to their dad. My dad grabbed his father by the hand, and together the three of them ran away, but not before their father was tempted to look back. He did, and the lady responded with a vile scream. She sounded like she was in pain or angry. After running for another 16 or 17 minutes, thinking they're finally safe, their father knelt down before them and asked the children what happened back there. And my dad, being a child still and believing all the boogeymans from the stories he's been told, he knew what to say. He knew who she was, so he replied, "La Llorona," which means the weeping woman. His dad was of course skeptical. La Llorona was simply a bedtime story to them. Instead, his father simply thought that it was a crazed woman. Later that same day, his father went back with a rifle this time, but he didn't find any trace of the woman who'd been there. But he found the mud balls she had been making. Ever since then, no one in their family would go back to the lake, not without protection, and perhaps because he may have believed the story of La Llorona, their father would keep close as the children drank from the water. I often go to Mexico to visit my family, and I want to tell you the lady my dad saw is real. At least I know she's real. I've heard her before. Her screaming, her crying. It's something you don't want to hear, especially in the middle of the night. The Christmas Witch, submitted by Nicotine Queen. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was the last Christmas that we had as a whole family. By that I mean my mom, dad, and sister, and myself. You see, my parents divorced when I was 7, and this was around that time. I'd always believed in ghosts and spirits, whatever you choose to call them. My mother and grandmother do as well. It was a belief they passed down to their children. I grew up in a single wide trailer in a pretty busy trailer park in the lower thumb of Michigan. It was so cold that year, and I recall playing outside with my friends that Christmas Eve. We went sledding down a makeshift snow hill near the playground in the center of the park itself. My friends and I stayed until it was getting dark, and then we rushed home to start the festivities. The way home, I began to feel a sense of dread, which was so odd as it was almost Christmas. I should have been excited, not worried about something. I tried to shake the feeling, thinking it was just my anxiety, which I had even at that young age. Soon I got home and walked inside, and that's where things began to feel off. Immediately, I knew something was going on with my parents, yet at the time, I wasn't even sure what the word divorce meant. My sister, who was 4 years older than me, did understand though, and I think it was her vibes that she knew what was going on that sent me off the edge. Everyone and everything else felt fake, like an act, like they were putting on a show, like they knew it was going to be the last Christmas together. Fast forward to my sister and I getting ready for bed. At this point, I'd forgotten or simply ignored that impending sense of doom. I remember being in the bath. I had my plastic critters in there for fun. I went under the water, and that feeling of dread all but overwhelmed me. Now, I can't open my eyes underwater, not without goggles, even non-chlorinated water. But I felt as if someone was looming right over the bathtub in such a way I thought they'd push my head down with their hand at any moment and drown me. Terrified, I jumped up, gasping for air. My mom heard me and yelled, "Are you okay?" Breathing heavily, I replied, "Yeah, I'm fine." Just got water stuck in my throat is all, wrong tube. Creepy as it was, nothing was there. I was alone in the bathroom. Slowly, I got out. I can't explain it, but I felt that if I made any sudden movements, or if I even acknowledged the fact that something was in there with me, things would get worse. Once I was out of that bathroom, I walked down the hall to my family in the living room. This part is important, due to the layout of my house. When you walked into the front door, you were immediately in the living room. To your right is the kitchen, and my mom's room was in the very front. If you looked left, it'd be the rest of the living room, and then the hallway. The first room on the left of the hallway was my room that I shared with my sister, then the washer and dryer, and then the bathroom. The very end of the house had our playroom. I wasn't able to sleep alone back then, so I wasn't able to utilize the extra room, not until I turned 12. Well, we sat down on the couch next to the front door, and we watched a Christmas movie, ate some holiday snacks until it was time to go to bed. But when that time came, I felt like I absolutely could not leave the comfort of my mom and dad, and I begged to sleep with them. Something was wrong, I just didn't know what. But I would in a few hours, unfortunately. Sadly, they said no, something I wouldn't understand until I grew up myself. So they sent me to bed and I dragged my feet the whole way. My sister and I had bunk beds back then. I was on top and she had the bottom bunk. To say I was a light sleeper would be an understatement, but my sister, she could sleep through the end of the world. She was already curled up and lightly snoring by the time I was able to close my eyes at all and try to force myself to sleep. Finally, though, it came. It was probably around 2 or 3 hours later, if I had to guess. I was awakened from a deep sleep and my eyes shot open. I felt so cold and everything around me seemed darker than normal. I was facing the wall, and slowly I turned over onto my other side, expecting to see my worst nightmare. But there was nothing there. I sighed in relief. I shut my eyes once more and tried to doze off. From my room, you could make out the light from the tree. My eyes shot open again when I thought I heard something. I thought maybe one of our cats was playing with the ornaments. They would always knock the whole tree over from that. My second thought was maybe Santa. Excitedly, I got up. My anxious heart was racing, which had totally drowned out my doubt and fear that I'd been having. But still, something deep down was telling me to stop, telling me that I shouldn't move and that I should go back to bed. I should have listened. I had gently and as quietly as possible climbed down the ladder. As soon as I hit the ground, it enveloped me. Fear. I almost ran back up, but oddly, as much as I was scared, I knew I had to look. As I made my way across the room, I noticed the previous sound was gone, the sound of ornaments being clanked and moved. I reached the end, and the doorway loomed over me like a gateway to hell. I peeked over the side, my palms sweating like it was 100 degrees in there, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. Then I saw the figure, and I almost passed out from fright. There was someone standing by my tree with her back slightly turned toward me. It was an old woman. Well, what I thought was an old woman anyway. From that angle, all I could make out was her long, stringy grayish hair. It was white and seemed to flow with no wind. She was wearing a black cloak, which was hooded over her head. She seemed to be looking at our tree. I watched her grab one of the ornaments, look it over, and then place it in an area of the tree it wasn't at before. This is important for later, keep that in mind. Then I noticed something that made me sick. Her hands were rotten. You could see where her flesh was coming off, her bones were poking through. When I saw that, I must have made some noise, because she slowly turned around. It was like slow motion. I froze in place, and when I saw her face, I thought I was going to die. She wore a smile on that face that clearly wasn't human. It stretched across her face and made all the veins and muscles show. Her teeth were dark yellow, and some were even black, where she had teeth anyway. And her eyes were black pits with a hint of white, far back in her skull. Suddenly, to my horror, she motioned for me to come closer, and that somehow broke my trance. I booked it back into bed, covered my head with sheets and a blanket, and I cried. I must have managed to pass out at some point, because the next thing I knew, it was Christmas Day. I sat up, looked around, and thought I just had a bad nightmare. I couldn't have been more relieved. I made my way to where everyone was waiting for me, and we began to open gifts. As we sat playing with our new treasures, I happened to look up at the tree, and then my heart sank. The ornament. The same ornament from my supposed nightmare. It was in the same place the woman had left it, not where we had put it. I'd remember that. I'd put almost all those ornaments on the tree myself. I must have looked white as a ghost, because my dad asked me if I was sick. I said I was fine and pretended to be. But deep down, something clicked. Something was wrong. Later on, I talked to my mother and explained what had happened. When I told her, she got a look on her face, a look that made me more scared. She had heard it too the previous night, and like me, she nearly assumed it was the cats playing with the ornaments. But then she said something else, something I didn't know about until then. She'd locked up the cats in the extra room, so that they wouldn't cause any problems with the Christmas tree. Still, even if it was cats, somehow, how did the ornament end up in a different spot? When she realized I was about to cry, she immediately tried to change her story, saying that I probably dreamt it after hearing that sound, yada yada. Bravely, in the middle of my tears, I reached up to grab the ornament, and I looked it over. There was a single scratch mark on the ornament, as if one sharply nailed thumb had skimmed across the surface. I went to show my mother, but she just changed her story again, completely conflicting with her last one, saying that she had changed it last night after she got out of bed, but she had just told me that she didn't get out of bed last night, even after hearing those sounds. Better yet, her face said it all. There was a look of panic and horror on her face, a look I've never seen my mom have before. That may have been the scariest part of all. I knew what I'd seen was real. I knew I'd been awake, and I haven't a clue what that woman was, who she was, and why she was there. Ever since then, I've hated Christmas. Still, I get that feeling every once in a while around that time of year, but I've never seen her again, thank God. Deep in my heart, I'm afraid that one day I will, though. That's what I'm scared of the most. Witch in the Park. Submitted by Anonymous. This story doesn't take place in the US. It takes place instead in southeastern Europe, in Croatia to be more precise, in the city of Dubrovnik. If any of you have seen Game of Thrones, you might recall the scene of Joffrey's wedding. The park where that scene took place is the very same park in which my story took place. Now, the park isn't that large at all. Even in the most isolated spot of the place, You're probably just 2 minutes of walking distance away from the nearest house. You could probably walk through the entire park in just 10 minutes. But when it gets dark, that's not to say it doesn't get really, really creepy. The first part of the story happened probably a bit less than a year ago. My girlfriend and I were walking in the more wooded area of the little park. But still, even there, we were about 10 seconds away from the nearest house. My girlfriend is the type to be easily scared, so I was poking fun of her for being scared at the park. She was begging to leave, but I assured her we had nothing to worry about, that we'd be leaving in a minute or two. But as I explained to her why she shouldn't be scared, we suddenly heard something that scared both of us. I can best describe it as a witch's cackle, like that cliché cackle you hear in kids' movies. Before that, the whole night, we hadn't heard any previous noise, no signs of people talking or walking or being out there at all. Nothing like it. Nor did it come from the direction of the houses I mentioned before. It came from the only direction there were no people, no civilization. And as we stood there frozen in the silence after that cackle, we saw a figure in the distance, a thin and frail figure, walking in an odd gait, as if there was something wrong with their shoulder or side. Whoever it was had their hands up to their chest and their head cocked to the side as they sort of limped towards us. That was all it took for us to start running out of there. Once we were on the road again, my girlfriend began crying out of fear. We mostly wrote off the experience as someone screwing with us, that maybe we were the center of some prank, but the memory of it still haunts us a bit, and we didn't return to that park together for some time. The next part of the story takes place half a year after that, somewhere a bit before the December of 2016. This time, my girlfriend or anybody else wasn't present there. It happened somewhere around 3 to 5 in the morning. I can't remember exactly. Now I'll say it, I was drunk, but not the drunk people imagine when somebody says drunk. I'd basically drunk enough that I would be relaxed, enough to dance at a previous club I'd been at. So as the night was passing and the last drink I had was hours ago, I started to feel more and more sober. I wasn't in many clubs in my life, so I don't know if it's like this everywhere. But the first sign of getting sober in this club isn't the return of your self-awareness or the realization of how bad you danced. More so, it's the heat. The unbearable heat that drives anybody insane, except the one who's drunk, because they're too drunk to notice. So as I said before, I was getting sober, and the heat was getting unbearable. So I decided to go take a walk. During my walk, I felt I needed to relieve myself, and since I didn't feel like going back to that hell just yet, and I didn't want to be a jerk and pee on someone's door, I decided to take my call of nature to nature herself. I walked up the nearby hill to the park, and I didn't venture too deep, maybe 50 meters from the entrance, and I started going. But when I heard that same laugh my girlfriend and I had heard before, the same cackle coming roughly from the same direction, my whole body just stopped. I froze for a second, took the next few silent moments to finish what I was doing, and I walked as fast as I could out of there, without stumbling to the ground. As I walked away from the park entrance, I looked back, and there was someone else there. The same feminine and frail figure as before. It was facing me, before I heard that cackle come again, and this time I knew it was coming from her, whatever it was. I haven't had any similar experiences since then, and I haven't heard of anyone else having those experiences. It's a frequent place to walk your dog during the day, and a popular spot for all sorts of metalheads and hipsters. So I hope it's just some random coincidence. I hope it is a continuation of a prank, even if there were months between those incidents. Nothing else makes sense, and I really hope it's not some witch trying to scare the wits out of me. The Witch of Pine Forest by Garth K. There's an old legend my family has passed down for years, one that you won't hear commonly down in Pine Forest, Texas. It's not one of those urban legends that the townsfolk and kids tell and repeat until it becomes something nonsensical. Rather, it's something that, if you were to ask nearly any of the residents of Pine Forest about, they'd raise their eyebrow at you and wonder what you've been inhaling. This is the legend of the Witch of Pine Forest, and it is preceded by my very own encounter with what I thought was just a story to scare me as a child. It was told to me by my grandmother Bonnie. She had children late in life, so by the time I was old enough to remember her, she was sadly struggling with intense cancer. Only 2 years after I remember being told this story, Grandma Bonnie passed away after losing the battle. God rest her soul. It was an evening that I spent the night with her and Grandpa. My parents dropped me off, needing a night alone. We stayed up playing Yahtzee, Scrabble, and watching Looney Tunes on the small TV they had on the kitchen countertop. The moment I started yawning, though, Grandma knew it was my bedtime. She had Grandpa carry me to bed, and as I was being tucked in, Grandma was saying her goodnights. I remember clearly what happened next. The sound of a branch hitting the window in the guest room that I was staying in. I jumped, nearly crying at the sound. My grandma settled me down and said there was nothing to worry about. But there was a look on her face. Was it remembrance? I don't know. But it was odd to me, even at that age. You know, she started in a way that sounded like she just remembered something important that she had to tell me. I've never told you about the Witch of Pine Forest. I was immediately creeped out, and it was obvious enough to my grandma that she then tried to comfort me. It's just a story, child. Don't worry. It's a good story, though. A story a child like you needs to hear. Teach you a lesson, a moral. You like that kind of story, right? Like the tortoise and the hare. I nodded quietly. It's like that. So nothing to be scared of. My eyes widened, and I pulled the blanket tightly over myself. I thought I was ready. I was not. She began. A long time ago, there was an old lady who loved children. She was known around these parts for giving kids homemade candy, licorice, caramels, things like that. She made it herself just to give away to the children. Some of the parents began to grow suspicious of her. At the time, children disappearing was common. People disappearing was common. Wild animals got hungry in the winter months. The natives often did what they could despite the locals, and without many laws or people to police those laws, trust in your fellow neighbor wasn't likely. When a certain boy never came home one evening, the town was quick to blame the old lady. Even when they found the boy, lost in the woods and injured from coyotes, they took out their fears on the old lady. They burned down her home, and with nothing more than a bag of what was left of her homemade candy, she was banished into the wilderness. At her age, she was sure not to survive. Ever since that day, some have said to have seen an old decrepit silhouette in the woods, standing and watching. Many children have reported over the years that a strange-looking old woman tried to call them into the woods, offering them treats from her bag of candy. So what I have to say is this, hon. When you hear or see something strange in the woods of Pine Forest, ignore it, and it will go away. And never, ever take candy from a strange old woman standing near the trees. Needless to say, I was as horrified as I was confused. I was looking at this story as just that, a story. But I couldn't stop wondering why she acted like it wasn't a story. Why she was making it sound so real, so creepy. She sighed, kissed my forehead, and went off to bed with Grandpa. She left me in that room with only the light from the cracked door shining on my chest. I watched the window that night, watching the tree branch outside sway in the moderate winds. It wasn't until 5 years afterward that this story came to life for me in a way that I wish wasn't true. Grandma was gone, and Grandpa, still able to walk but just barely, was lonely. So I'd often visit him over the weekends to keep him company. We'd watch TV near the fireplace, talk about tales from his youth, and reminisce about Grandma. One night he asked me to fetch some logs for the fire. He hired some guys every so often to chop some up and stack them outside by the house. As such, all I had to do was go outside, grab a few logs, and get back inside where it was warm, as it was an especially cold Texas winter. I put on my coat and went out the door. I circled the house and made my way quickly to the stack of logs outside. To my right, maybe 15 yards from me, was the tree line that encompassed the perimeter of Grandpa's home. I continued my task. 1 log, 2 logs, 3 logs. Maybe I could fit a 4th in my arms, I wondered. As I struggled to grab a 4th log, I heard something. A sound that broke the quiet of the night. "Hello, youngin'." It was an ancient voice coming from somewhere close. The voice nearly reminded me of my grandma's, but that was most likely my memory being hazy. I turned in the direction of the sound and saw a dark shape standing amidst the trees. The voice continued, "Out fetching wood to keep warm." "Well, yeah. Are you lost?" I asked. "There's not another house around here for a while. Would you like to come inside?" "No," she chuckled. "But I might have something to help you keep warm. Do you like candy?" My heart stopped. My clearest and most vivid memory of my grandma came back to me. The witch of Pine Forest, the old lady who gave out candy. "Caramels, drops, butterscotch. Tell me, boy, what's your favorite? Come over here." She waved her hand in her direction to beckon me over. "And you can choose what you like." I was steadily making my way to the corner of the house. Once there, I could make a quick sprint for the front door. Without either of us uttering another word, I was able to round that corner, cutting off my view of the dark shadow in the woods. I made my way to the front door, but I nervously dropped one of the logs on the front steps. As I quickly bent down to pick it up, I looked toward the corner of the house where I'd just come from. I jumped back, dropping the remainder of the logs. The silhouette of the old lady was now at the corner of the house where I'd been seconds ago. She was still somehow covered in enough darkness that I could not make out many details.
"Oh dear, why would you ignore me like that? I just want to give you a treat."
What now horrified me and kept me unable to speak at all was how tall her silhouette was. From that distance, I could make out her height. She stood to the height of the bottom of the roof of the house, tall enough to latch up and crawl onto the roof with ease if she so desired. I freaked out, clawing at the doorknob as my numb hands slid off once, twice, 3 times before I finally had the door opened and I was falling onto the floor. My grandpa, having been standing by the window watching everything, quickly shut the door behind me and locked it. He shushed me with a finger to his mouth and beckoned me to follow him to the kitchen, where we sat in bright light and silence for about an hour. Eventually, Grandpa spoke.
"It's good of you to listen to your grandma, boy. Never forget what she told you."
I couldn't reply. Maybe I was in shock, maybe I was just that dumbfounded. All I could do was sit there until my grandpa felt safe enough to go to bed, and I went to the guest room, drew the curtains closed, and watched old VHS movies on the old TV there. Some stories are more than stories. Some stories are warnings. If I hadn't been told that story by my grandma, I would not have recognized the Witch of Pine Forest. And I may not be here now to share this warning with you. Witch's Ghost by the Raptor. This is the story of what happened to me one night on a little country farm road at the foothills of the North Georgia mountains, Dahlonega to be more specific. I met up with two of my best friends one night because we decided that we were going to explore and do a bit of ghost hunting at a cemetery that was at a nearby church. There are some pretty old graves in this older section of the cemetery there, and there is a legend or rumor that a witch is buried there. So the place truly does have an eerie feel to it. I've been to several cemeteries that are actually quite peaceful feeling, but this cemetery, especially with the witch supposedly in it, is not one of them. If you know the area, you probably know the place I'm talking about. My friends and I were in our early 20s at the time. We'll call my friends Mark and John for the story. Mark, John, and I met up at one of John's relatives' houses, which was only about a mile from the cemetery. We all rode to the cemetery in Mark's car. I believe the time of year was fall, and it wasn't raining or foggy that night, just an average night. We made it to the cemetery and drove down to the older section of graves, which is separated by a stretch of grass and a fairly long, narrow paved road. The old cemetery is actually kind of like an island or mound of dirt, with the road circling around it and a section of woods around the back on two sides. There are old concrete steps that lead up into the cemetery on the front side, and a concrete wall lining the front of the large mound of earth. I honestly don't remember if this was my first time walking around the place, or maybe my second. Either way, when you begin walking up that first concrete step, you immediately feel different. Like you're no longer alone, like the very air surrounding you has become thick, not with humidity, but with a presence. Like you stepped back in time, but into the most troubled place. Mark, John, and myself were no professionals, of course. We were just a few guys with some free time, some camera phones, and the desire to capture any paranormal evidence we could on video or pictures, but mostly just having a good time. We had our fun, took pictures and videos, maybe stayed 45 minutes to an hour and a half. While it was a creepy place, we didn't encounter anything that night at the cemetery. But of course, I wouldn't be typing this right now if the night was paranormally uneventful for me. We got back in Mark's car and headed back to the house where our cars were. We stood in the driveway talking for a while, discussing the night and looking at some of the pictures. Finally, when it was ready to leave and I said my goodbyes, John said, "Hey, if you're going home, just take the back road near the house, and it'll get you back to the road quicker." Thinking nothing of it and ready to go home, I piled into my '88 Lincoln Town car and headed down the road. The road was in a partially wooded area at first, and shortly after it opened up, and it was just farm fields and a couple of barns on either side, with some houses in the distance. The road was pretty straight at this point. It took no turns, but this is where my night was about to take an interesting and terrifying turn. Remember, it wasn't raining, and I didn't see any fog that night. There I was, cruising along in my smooth ride, going maybe 30 or 40 on the backcountry farm road that night, and it happened. Something I always had reason to believe, but wanted to see for myself. Maybe 100 feet in front of the car, in the middle of the road, there was something. It was like fog, but I know it wasn't, because this supposed fog was in the shape of a person. Little patches of fog are horizontal, not vertical, but this ghost or spirit or fog, it didn't have any discerning sharp details that I could make out. Just a foggy shape of a person, standing in the 5 to 6 foot range. Hard to say, because it happened so quickly, and scared the crap out of me. I saw it in my path, and my mouth would have been in my lap if that were possible. I was just driving, frozen, hands on the wheel. It dispersed as it hit my windshield. It couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 seconds later when my headlights began to shut off. My arm hairs were immediately standing at attention, and my headlights had gone off for a few seconds, but those seconds felt like forever. The lights went on, flickered, then turned off, like the power was being sapped from them. I couldn't believe what was happening. The car had an automatic headlight dimmer switch, and I later had to replace the part because in the next week or two, randomly when I was driving at night, the headlights would once again shut off then come back on. As I got to the end of that road, I pulled over onto the shoulder, kinda regrouped in my mind, and called my friends and told them what happened. They believed me and seemed amazed. Perhaps what I encountered that night was the spirit of the witch, angry that we had messed around at her burial site. I'd always wanted some kind of evidence of ghosts or something like it, and for me it finally happened with an experience. So just remember, when you go looking for ghosts, you may just find what you're looking for. Modern Witch Hunt by Marie R. I was 15 when I had a haunting experience in Salem, Massachusetts. I was doing an investigation with the Paranormal Salem team, and right when I arrived, I felt a very bad feeling. We started in this little area where there were little stones that marked people who had passed during the Salem witch trials. For a minute, it was a little hard to breathe, but that's nothing compared to what else I felt that night. We went by the infamous witch house, which is where Bridget Bishop was the first to reside. Legend had it that she bewitched people in their dreams. We were only a few feet from the building when the sensation of dread came back, taking my breath away. There was such an evil feeling to it, as if someone was standing behind me. When I turned around, nothing was there. As I was walking through the nearby parking lot, I got a huge spike on the meter, which was probably in the 60s range. At the same time, it was getting extremely cold, to the point that I could see my breath in the air, which was bizarre because all day before this, it had been extremely hot compared to the usual weather. I felt as if an energy had passed through me. It was a sort of you just want to wet yourself kind of feeling. It was so creepy. Not to mention the sensation of something playing with my hair, something like a cold hand. I can't even watch Ghost Adventures anymore without remembering these sensations. Home Intruder by Miriam. It was a long time ago. I must have been 6 years old. Growing up, my mom used to tell me stories. One that I remember prominently was that if I didn't sleep, a witch would come to scare me. She gave it a backstory and everything. It was very late one night. If I could guess, it was roughly 1 a.m. I used to sleep with my parents when I was little, so both of them were asleep at the time. I woke up to a cold gust of wind coming from the window. I opened my eyes. It was a full moon, so I was able to see quite a bit. That's when I saw something in front of me, a tall, dark figure moving very slowly. Now, I don't remember vividly what it looked like, but I do remember the figure had a very bad posture, walking with a badly hunched back, and an unnatural-looking head larger than a normal person's. But it was very light on its feet, making no noise at all as it moved through my room. 6-year-old me was thinking it was a witch, so I pretended to sleep while at the same time trying to wake up my parents, which I unfortunately failed to do so. The creepy thing is, nothing was stolen or taken, and no one was harmed. I told my mom this story not long ago, and she honestly looked terrified, knowing that someone or something was in her house, all while they were sleeping. The Witch on My Street by Graham. When I was in grade school, I was always told to stay away from the house at the end of our street. This was an order I didn't dare go against, because a creepy old woman lived there. She always stared at the people who walked by, as if cursing us for existing. The woman had an extreme dislike for kids as well, and at one point, she called me over to her porch. I thought she needed help, so I hesitantly walked over. Though once I was there, she spat on me, said something in a language I didn't understand, then tried to scratch me with her massive fingernails. But by then, I was running off of her porch. Now, I've seen some weird things going on at her place. Missing pets were often blamed on her, some of which I last saw in her yard. The most horrifying thing, though, something that I can't explain, it's what happened to my friend Benjamin. Benjamin liked to tease the old woman and would take time out of his day to play just in front of her gate on the sidewalk. Here's the weird part, something I doubt anyone here would believe. There was a day she was especially angry at Benjamin, as he had accidentally kicked his ball in her yard. He jumped over the fence, grabbed it, and quickly ran out in seconds' time. But it was plenty of time for the old woman to see him and spit those curses at him as she chased him out of her yard. Little did I know that that was the last I'd ever see of Benjamin. After not seeing him for a straight week, which was already impossible and bizarre, I asked my parents if he had moved or something, without me seeing or knowing about it. My parents were confused. They acted like they had no idea who Benjamin was, apparently forgetting somehow the sleepovers we had had. I decided to walk over to his house. I knocked on the door, and the people I thought were his parents acted the same way when I brought it up. They acted like they never had a son. I stayed far away from the house at the end of the street after that, and I remember praying for the longest time that my family would decide to move. You see, I didn't want me or my family to be the next ones to disappear. I don't know if the woman at the end of the street is still around these days, but if I were you, I would leave any creepy old ladies living alone to themselves.
The Witch of Pine Bluff. Submitted by Terman Shank. A decade back, I lived in a quiet, forest-surrounded town called Pine Bluff. I loved it there. especially since we lived out in the boondocks, where it would take you a good 20-minute drive to reach the center of town. Our little rural homestead was a dirt road off a dirt road, surrounded by evergreens. It was absolutely beautiful. The first thing I noticed about the place was its refreshing smell. Sadly, any smell disappears as you get used to it. During one summer, my family wanted to go out onto our land and do some camping. We had several acres or so, as Dad thought he'd be doing quite a bit of hunting after we moved down there. He was wrong. Work took up most of his time. We ended up camping for a week in a couple of different clearings, passing the days with fishing, stories, and board games. It was and still is my favorite family vacation in memory, even after things started to get really weird and creepy. Now, our family of 5 couldn't all fit in one tent. We didn't have very large tents to begin with, so my mom and 2 sisters shared one and my dad and I took the other. A few days in, during the middle of the night, I was so close to falling asleep. That was until I heard footsteps. I could hear the feet or paws of some forest critter skulking about our dark, quiet camp in the clearing. It wasn't all too surprising. I was sure we left many crumbs and scraps from the messy s'mores we had eaten, but that doesn't mean it wasn't spooky. I tried to play Sherlock Holmes, laying there in the tent in the dark, trying to deduce what kind of animal was outside based only on the sound of its footsteps. They were a bit heavy and slow, spaced sporadically, but it was more like a cautious person rather than a curious creature. Slowly, but surely, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I began to suspect that we weren't the only people out there on our property in the middle of the night. Then came the moaning. It sounded like a frail old woman crying, like seriously crying as if she had lost the thing she loved most in the world. Worst of all, though, it came from right outside the nylon tent, only a few feet away from where my head rested. Have you ever been so sad or maybe terrified that tears started to flow down your face without you ever sobbing? That was me, laying there under my blanket, listening to the most frightening presence I had ever experienced. Very slowly, I turned toward my sleeping dad, but he was not asleep at all. He was looking at me with a finger over his mouth, shushing me silently. His eyes were wide and aware. This really shook me to my core, because my dad looked as scared as I was. I don't know why we sat still there when some possibly dangerous stranger roamed around our camp. We could have been in danger, my whole family, but maybe we were just all too scared to confront whatever was outside our tents. The moaning grew louder, and I saw the faint shadow of 5 fingers, a hand, appear on the nylon of the tent, just above my head. The fingers appeared thin and bony. Better yet, they twitched about as if the person couldn't keep their nerves in check. Then, all at once, both bony hands came down on the tent as this woman began clawing in at us. That's when my dad jumped up, grabbed his torchlight, and ran outside. Curious and scared, I ran with him, if not just to get away from the scratching woman. Outside, I heard the thing running towards the woods. In a nick of time, my father shone the flashlight in its direction, and sure enough, we both caught sight of something that will forever be burned into our minds. It was a pale, sagging figure of a thin person. It was definitely a woman. She was completely naked, with dirty gray hair and bones protruding from her skin like she hadn't eaten in weeks. Her fingers ended in nails that curled around themselves. They looked like they hadn't been cut for so long. And despite being thin, she had a tiny pot belly like you'd see on a child. The worst part was the fact that, before she disappeared into the woods, she glanced back at us, eyes turning yellow in the glare of the torchlight. Needless to say, we did not pursue the strange, bestial woman. Immediately, my dad ran over to check on the girls, all of whom were wide-eyed and huddled together in their tent. They said they had heard the wailing woman as well. There were 2 more days of vacation left, and lucky me, Dad wanted to finish the vacation in spite of the witch woman, because, in his own words, this would be the only full vacation he'd have for another year. His choice to not call it quits is the reason why this story didn't end there, because the next 2 nights I did not sleep. It's very difficult to sleep when the sound of a crying woman echoed from the nearby tree line. Both of those nights, I made sure my dad was awake with me. After the first night, he had gotten his gun from the truck and kept it near him in the tent. It didn't make me feel any safer, though. I don't know what we encountered that vacation week. It was terrifying, to say the least. The sight of that strange, haunting ghost of a woman is something I just can't forget. My family has given a name to this woman who has caused us endless nightmares ever since. She is the Witch of Pine Bluff, and you'd better hope you have more than a thin layer of tint protecting you the next time you go camping. Lechuza, submitted by Texan Witch Girl. I know this might sound crazy, believe me, I know. When I was 5, my mom told me this story about when I was a baby, when we lived by the border. She said we lived in a small home. It was my mother, my dad, and myself. I was just a newborn, and as she would clean the house, she would open up the windows. My crib was right next to one of these windows, and she would let the breeze come in. Mom told me that that day she had just placed me down for a moment. Then she turned and saw the Lechuza, a witch who turns into a bird. It was watching me. Mom told me she was frightened and watched as the bird stood over me watching me sleep. After a couple of minutes, the bird flew away. She said she closed the window in a hurry and rushed over to her mom's house and told her everything that had happened. My grandmother told my mom to pour some salt on the window where I would sleep. My grandmother also told my mom that the witches knew when there was a new baby in the house, a baby that hadn't been baptized yet, they would come and snatch them away. I am now 25 and my mom tells me to watch out. Those birds are bad luck, and there are witches who let their birds eat their eyes so that the birds can see for them. I know it all sounds a bit crazy, but there's crazier stuff that goes on in this world. I don't have any kids of my own, but my sister does. In fact, 2 nights ago, we were sitting outside my parents' house here in Fort Worth, Texas, when we suddenly heard loud laughter. We had music on at the time, and the music was pretty loud, so it must have been a very loud laugh. Even my dad asked, "Did you hear that?" My sister and I looked at each other and realized that it might be the Lechuza, and my niece was out there playing. My sister and I walked up to the tree where the laughter came from, and we shone the flashlight up at it. When we see this huge bird sitting in the tree, immediately we all went back inside. Dad picked up my niece and took her in the house quickly. And luckily for us, we haven't seen or heard anything of the Lechuza since. Just be careful out there with your babies. A bird landing on your windowsill or on the baby's crib could be pretty. You might even think it's neat, but they could be staring down at your baby for the most evil reasons. La Llorona, submitted by SG. Now, English is my second language, so bear with me here. This story is not mine, but my dad's. It happened 20 years ago in Mexico. Just to clarify where this took place, our town at the time was very small, and everyone knew each other. Also, keep in mind that most front doors in Mexico have a small glass window you can open up without having to open the entire door. To give you an idea of my parents' house, it has several bedrooms downstairs and 2 hallways that are pretty much shaped like an L. Now, let's begin. There was a knock at the front door around 2 or 3 in the morning. I don't exactly remember. The knock was really loud enough to wake up my mother and my dad, whose bedroom was the last one from the hallway. My dad hesitantly got up, got his gun, and began to walk towards the door. As soon as he was about to open the glass window to check who was outside, he heard someone behind him. It was my older brother. He was 19 at that time. Apparently, he had heard the knock too, and it woke him up. He was half asleep, just standing outside of his room, staring, waiting without saying a word to see who would be knocking at this time. As soon as my dad opened up the glass door, this freezing cold breeze hit his face with an awful smell of sulfur, combined with something he describes as rotten and moldy. And there, in front of him, was this lady in a dress. She wasn't old exactly. If he had to guess, he said she was probably in her 40s. She looked at my father and said, "Do you know where the cemetery is?" My dad said he got chills immediately, and his body was covered in goosebumps. He said he was never so terrified in his life. After a moment, he replied with, Yes, just Take this street, it will take you straight to it. It's about a 15-minute walk. He then pointed to her left, the direction she should take. She didn't look at him. She then turned and started walking the complete opposite side the way he had told her. She didn't say a word after that. The opposite direction she was heading towards was the un rio, a river. The following morning, my dad was outside sweeping the sidewalk when la vecina, the neighbor, came over and asked my mother and my dad if we had heard La Llorona the night before, and once again my dad got goosebumps. To this day, my dad is convinced that that lady was La Llorona, and I kid you not when I say that my dad stutters every time he tells someone new about his encounter. The Boy at My Window, submitted by Brianna Banana. As a child, I lived in a simple 4-bedroom home with my mom, my dad, my brothers, my aunt, my uncle, and cousins. Yes, cram-packed, I know. During the day, the house felt homely. My cousins felt more like siblings, and we would play all the time together. However, at night, it was a completely different story. I grew up in an extremely superstitious family, and we all believe in spirits, good and bad. One day, my grandma came to visit us, and she is what they call a curandera, which roughly translates to good witch or healer that can cure people. My grandma has always been able to see and sense spirits. When she first visited our home, she told us that she sensed 3 spirits there, that of a man, that of a woman, and that of a little boy. The woman would walk around the living room and the kitchen, while the boy was always in the backyard, and the man would usually always be in the garage. He was the darkest spirit of all. Not as well as my grandma, most of my family can sense spirits. Some of us can even see them. I, however, have never really been as good at sensing the spirits as the rest of my family. But one night, through my 4-year-old cousin, I met the little boy in the backyard. Since my cousin Allie and I were the only girls, and we were the same age, we shared the same room. Our room was towards the back of the house, so we had a window facing the backyard. I was 12 at the time, and my little cousin Damien would come sleep in our room once in a while. He was often scared because of his nightmares. He usually slept with his older sister, but one night he came later than usual and she was already asleep, so I told him he could sleep with me. We climbed into bed, we did our prayers, turned off the light, and I told him to go to sleep. A few minutes later, I hear him crying. I turn over and I asked him what was wrong, to which he replied to me, "There's a boy at the window." I turned to look at the window and I don't see anything there, but needless to say, I was very, very frightened. We all knew about the little boy, but he never did anything to us. So I ignored it and told him to just turn around and face the wall. Another minute passes by and he says, "He's still there. He won't stop staring at Allie." For some reason, all the spirits in the house were always really attracted to my cousin Allie. It might have been because she was the most malicious out of all of us, because she was very manipulative and a compulsive liar. Anyway, at this point I was tired. I just wanted to go to bed. My grandma had once told us, cursing at a ghost would make it go away, so I did just that. I opened the window and I yelled at it to F off. We're trying to sleep. I turned to Damien and he says, "The little boy is gone now." Satisfied, I lay back and say, "Okay, now go to sleep." But not more than a minute passes by when my cousin begins to tremble in terror, and he whimpers, "He's back. Oh no, he's mad." I tell him the boy can't do anything to us, to just go back to sleep. I have to admit, even I was terrified at this point. I never recalled a point where the spirits were this forward. Then my cousin slowly says, "He's not staring at Allie anymore. He's staring at you." My heart sank. I jumped out of bed and I turned the lights on. Then I yelled at Damien to tell him to get the hell out of my room, to go to his mom's room. I was shaking, I was crying. My mom and my aunt came running in to see what was wrong. I told them what had happened. and none of us slept in that room that night. Witch Possession, submitted by -12. I live in Colombia, and to tell you the truth, I've never experienced a lot of paranormal stuff. Only once, but that is for another time. On the other hand, my father has a lot of paranormal stories. Some of them happened to him, and other times he was only a watcher or he heard about them. So this experience did not happen to him personally, but to a friend of his that I actually know in real life. He's a business partner to my dad, or was. We will call him John. The story goes like this. John had a wife that we'll call Anna. She had a cousin who married a jerk of a guy, and that guy lived with his mother. Anna's cousin, Laura, after she married this guy Leonard, she moved in with him and they started with the married kind of life. She was really close with Anna and her family, and they talked almost every day, but apparently this guy Leonard was the biggest douche and they would fight over a lot of things. When Laura got tired of all that was happening, she threatened to leave the house and threatened to get a divorce. But Maria, who was Leonard's mom, warned her that if she left, she would die. After the warning, she didn't care at all, and since nothing changed in her relationship with Leonard, she left and accepted her fate. She stayed at Anna's house with John and his family, and so it began. Time started to pass by and she started to deteriorate. She got thinner, and her face slowly changed or deformed. John says that eventually she began to look like some sort of thin creature. She didn't even act herself anymore. The doctors couldn't do anything about her. They said they didn't know what was wrong. She was losing so much weight, but any pills, medicine she would take, it had no effect on the poor woman. John says that it was awful to see that. Even the room she was staying smelled awful, and she always had this blank stare, indifferent to anything that happened around her. John says that the most creepy thing of all was her voice, because her voice totally changed. It was nothing like it was supposed to be. It was really deep and raspy. In the last moments of her life, he told my dad about a conversation she had with a sister of hers. She asked if Laura knew who she was, and in a really disturbing voice, she replied,
"Of course, you are my little sister."
But her voice, the way she looked, the way she moved, it was like Laura was gone and some kind of evil spirit had possessed this poor woman. She died not too long after that, and when they performed an autopsy, everything got crazy. They wouldn't let me see her body, and the morgue called the police. The police asked some questions here and there, and well, that was the end of it. The investigation went nowhere. The police were involved for a while. They had an investigation going over what happened to Laura. We never knew what happened after that, because my father stopped working with him last year. And well, my dad is a very religious man. He has a background with it, because he was raised in a really isolated town with a lot of witchcraft. He told me that Maria, Leonard's mom, was probably a witch, and when she warned her not to leave, but she left anyway, she sent a spirit to possess and slowly take her life away. It was truly disturbing to hear, and I can only wonder what happened after that.
The Island in the Lake, from Names James 0933. Rachel, my fiancée, and I were on hour 17 into our drive to her family's cabin in northern Minnesota for a small vacation. I glanced at her with heavy eyelids to see that she was fast asleep in the passenger seat. The last 2 hours of the trip were spent through desolate back roads in towns that consisted of 100 people and a lone stoplight. I could feel myself immersing into the solitude as the roads began to be labeled by numbers instead of names. Finally, I turned onto the long stretch of road that winded through the forest and led to our destination, the cabin. Siri let me know there was 2 miles left. Then everything went back to silence. The car slowly trudged over the underdeveloped road as large chunks of gravel crunched and tumbled beneath the wheels, while towering pine trees loomed above us, blocking out any stars. We arrived, and I was so exhausted that I considered just sleeping right there in the driveway. I'd never been to this cabin before, but upon first glance it was quite cozy. It's not one of those decked out cabins that rich people buy, but it had 3 bedrooms and set just offshore to a small 1,100-acre lake. We quickly unloaded everything and collapsed onto a bed that smelled older than time. Though we were completely beat, we were excited to spend some time away from it all. The sun lit up our room early the next morning, and I was filled with a huge sense of relief when, out of routine, I checked my phone to see that there was no service. Nobody could bother us even if they tried. Rachel offered to drive to the nearest town to get some groceries, so I could settle in and check out the cabin myself. I rifled through hundreds of dusty books that sat on the shelves in the living room. Then I pulled out a dozen board games as I excitedly planned out our time ahead. I made my way outside and onto the dock that stretched out into the lake. A small boat lightly rocked in the water, and the dock creaked and groaned underneath my feet. I stared out at the lake and finally felt the last of my anxiety dissipate. As the drive to town was around half an hour, I figured I would set out on the lake to do some fishing. A small island caught my eye that sat close to the middle of the water. It was maybe 100 yards in diameter and was filled with dense trees and shrubs. Something about it drew me toward it. I can't really describe it, but it's like it slowly sucked me in. The island had an almost eerie glow about it, like it wasn't really in the same world as ours. I anchored maybe 50 feet from the shore and started casting. It wasn't 30 seconds after that I felt something hit my boat. I had nearly had whatever was on the line up to the boat. It must have gotten off the hook, I thought, hit the boat before swimming away. When I reached out to reapply the bait, I saw a fish dangling off the end of the line still. An uneasy feeling washed over me when I saw that it was completely mangled. It was nearly ripped in half with tears all along what was left of its body. My first thought was that a bigger fish must have jumped on it, but I didn't feel any sort of struggle that would indicate such. Maybe an otter, I thought, but again, I didn't feel a struggle when I reeled it in. I tried to ignore this and moved on to the opposite side of the island, resuming my fishing. But again, the next thing I hooked suddenly stopped fighting. I pulled up another shredded fish carcass. This happened a few more times as I was just curious at this point as to what was happening. I looked toward the island and felt such dread, like the island itself had eyes and was staring me down. I slowly rowed myself away to another spot closer to the cabin and started to catch some actually intact fish, all the while taking brief glances at that island. After hauling in a decent-sized bass, I heard Rachel pull into the driveway, so I decided to make my way back and try to forget about this experience. Over dinner, I casually brought up the island to Rachel. So I saw there was this island in the middle of the lake. Have you ever been to it? I asked. Oh, that? Nah, my dad always just told us to not go over there. He said the land is still owned by the family of some woman who used to live there. She responded. Wait, someone used to live there? How? I asked. Yeah, he said that there was a woman who had a house there. She owned some knick-knack shop in town till around 50 years ago, when she died. She'd have to row to the dock every morning just to get to her car, she explained. Must have been a pain in the butt to get groceries there, I said with a laugh. Yeah, my dad said she was super creepy, and they would sometimes catch her staring at them from the shore while they fished, she elaborated. Well, that's just weird, I said, kind of laughing it off. Yeah, but I'm pretty sure none of it was real. I think he just told us those things to keep us from going to the lake and messing around, she said with a laugh of her own. The rest of the day was spent playing various board games, reading, and just lounging around the cabin. However, each time I passed the living room window, I felt that distinct feeling of being watched. Each time I would glance out to see that island looming in the distance. Curiosity was starting to nag at me, especially now that I was told that there was a house sitting by itself, probably untouched there for decades. A few days passed by, and we spent our time doing more of the same. While relaxing like this was exactly what I needed. I couldn't get my mind off of that island. I'd barely done any fishing since I did my first trip on the lake, as I always felt like something just didn't want me there. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided that once Rachel fell asleep, I was going to row out there to check it myself. It probably was just some urban legend her dad had concocted to scare the kids. But part of me wanted to know if it was real, wanted it to be real. I sat up in bed reading, waiting for Rachel to fall asleep. She fell asleep faster than anybody I'd ever met, and could sleep through a hurricane, so I knew I wouldn't have to wait too long. She really wasn't a fan of anything creepy, and going to an abandoned house in the middle of the night was not something she'd be interested in. But I did feel kind of bad doing this without telling her. Then again, I knew she would just protest if she knew. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, a hunting knife just in case, and my phone to record anything noteworthy. Rachel was asleep within minutes of laying her head down, and after waiting maybe 20 just to be safe, I turned out the lights and quietly made my way out of the cabin. It was dead quiet outside as I made my way down to the dock. No frogs, no crickets, nothing making a sound that night. I pushed off the dock and rowed my way toward the island. Each dip of the oars into the water seemed so loud in the complete silence of the night. I was so anxious to see if Rachel's dad's stories were true or just legend. Either way, there was something off about this island, and I desperately wanted to see it for myself. I pulled up to it and circled around for a minute. The moon was bright enough for me to see the shoreline as I scanned for any spots that were clear enough for me to set anchor. Finally, I spotted a stump jutting out from the land that was partially submerged. The boat drifted towards it as I grabbed a hold and hoisted myself onto the land. I tied the rope to the stump, and after making sure it was secure, I clumsily stepped through the thick brush until I made my way onto what appeared to be someone's yard. I switched on my flashlight to see a disheveled home sitting in the very middle of the island. It stood 2 stories, with rotting walls and a caved-in roof. No way, I thought to myself. There really is a house here. All of the windows were broken, and the entirety of the house was suffocated by an overgrowth of ancient vines. The trees were so dense around it that it blacked out the sky above as this house stood, forgotten by time. I remembered to pull out my phone right then, to capture anything I might find. I swept the beam of light over the house after I hit record, then I made my way over. My feet crunched on fallen, dead branches and leaves. That sense of dread returned to me with a vengeance. I'd come this far, and I was not going to turn back now. I shined the light on the front door that sat ajar. I shone the light through the openings where the windows used to be. It was eerie to say the least. Whoever lived here really must have owned a knick-knack shop or something, because dozens of miscellaneous items were strewn across the floor, coated in years of thick dust. A box spring mattress looked as if it had been thrown across the room as it sat partially upright against a decaying wall. I put my weight into the door, and it agonizingly creaked open, letting out decades of neglect. The air was dense and unforgiving as I swept my phone all around to record all these long-forgotten memories. Dozens of various trinkets, household tools, and ceramic animals covered the floors as I carefully stepped over the abandoned piles. I shifted the light to one corner of the room and felt my heart jump where I saw a pile of maybe a dozen baby dolls lying in a heap. I made my way towards them as the floor creaked and groaned. I was seriously starting to get the creeps as I noticed it was significantly colder in the house than it was outside in the summer night. Some of the dolls were missing their heads, while others had dirty and torn clothing on them. Right above the pile, I noticed a picture hanging on the wall. I blew off the thick coat of dust and went into a coughing fit as it blew directly back into my eyes and down my throat. When I came to, I saw it was one of those creepy old-timey photos of a family where no one was smiling, just vacant expressions staring back at me. There was a 30-something-year-old woman holding a baby with 2 little boys sitting by her sides. I realized they were standing in front of the house that I was currently invading. I turned around and my blood ran cold. Standing at the opposite edge of the room in a doorway was a small boy lit up in the beam of my flashlight. I jumped out of my skin and screamed as the light illuminated this figure. He was maybe 7 or 8 years old, with sandy blonde hair and deep brown eyes. The light in his face didn't seem to bother him as he stared straight through me. I quickly recognized his face as one of the boys in the photograph. "Sir, what are you doing here?" The words slithered out of his mouth and up my spine, sending a cold chill throughout my body. I sat there dumbfounded as I stammered at the ghostly figure. "Can you help my brother? Please, sir," the boy requested of me. I was speechless. He quickly turned and darted into the room behind him. I stood there for a moment, but then I realized I had all of this on video and I was seeing dollar signs. This was the most incredible and terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. I took a deep breath, made sure the phone was still recording, and made my way into the room. I passed through the doorway and into a room that looked pristine. Clean floors, painted walls, and wooden rocking chairs. It even appeared that night had turned back into day, as the room looked dimly lit in the early morning light. I spotted yet another child off in the corner, just sitting on the floor, looking away from me, while the one who urged me into the room was leaning over something wrapped up on a couch. I made my way over to him, then glanced over his shoulder to see a baby cuddled up in a blanket cocoon. "He feels cold, sir. He hasn't made a sound in a long time, and we don't know what's wrong," the little boy said to me with sadness in his voice. The other child began rocking nervously, hands clenched around his legs as he formed into a little ball. "Can you help us, sir?" the boy pleaded. The rocking child began to whimper and mumble under his breath. "I'm sorry, I don't know what I can do to help," I spoke to him. "Is your mother around? She can help you." It was at that moment that I heard a sound coming up from a staircase that I hadn't seen before. It started out very faint, but as the sound gradually grew, I could make out the heartbreaking sound of a woman crying. It persisted until it was a full-fledged wail that was ringing throughout the house. The boy rocking in the other corner quickly rose and sprinted out of the room. "You should leave, mister. She doesn't like visitors." At that moment, it was like something flipped a switch, and the once immaculate room was now dark and cluttered with disgusting furniture that was torn and rotting. The wailing from upstairs hadn't ceased, and I heard loud, vicious stomping on the floor right above me, rapidly, making its way to the staircase and starting the descent to the room I was in. I felt frozen in place. I shined the light down onto the couch to see a dirty, dust-caked doll lying there in a blanket. I looked back up at what sounded like a raging bull at the bottom of the stairs, then just stopped. So did the crying. I fell back and waited for what felt like hours for something to show itself. I tried to crawl backwards as my legs seemed to stop working. After what felt like an eternity, it started its way towards me, and my heart sank. Thud, thud, thud. Each pause between the steps was more suspenseful than the last. I sat there, hands shaking as my flashlight trembled with them. I tried to force myself to turn it off, but it was too late. I watched in horror as a figure dark as night with long wispy hair and gangly limbs lumbered into the room. It seemed to stop and face me for a moment, and I could feel tears running down my face. After a brief pause, it made its way to the couch. It looked down at the old doll and stroked its head with long, bony fingers. It let its face collapse into its hands, and it began sobbing once more. Same as before, it gradually grew louder and louder until it was nearly deafening. It picked up the doll and held it tight to its chest, before letting out an ear-piercing scream of pure despair. I was somehow able to get enough of a grip and pull out my knife, but as I did, this thing's neck violently twisted towards me and postured up. It towered high above me as its head nearly grazed the ceiling. At last, my legs found the strength I needed, and adrenaline kicked in. I stopped the video and pocketed my phone before making a mad dash for the door. I heard rapid, heavy stomps close the distance instantly, and I felt a tremendous force knock me through the doorway that I'd been running through. I frantically looked up as my flashlight had fallen from my hands, but I could still make out the figure hurling itself through the beam of light, which was coming from the flashlight wherever it had landed. A symphony of screaming and crying was coming from this thing. It stood over me as it pinned me to the ground with immense strength. I managed to shake my arm free. I then attempted to slash at its face with the knife, but it grabbed my wrist with such force that I felt it was going to snap my arm. It clenched its cold hands around mine and slowly guided the knife down towards my stomach. I tried punching it with my now free hand as it slowly lifted my shirt and began running the blade down my abdomen. I screamed out in pain as it pierced my skin. I felt warm blood slide down my sides. My free hand frantically grasped for anything to use to defend myself with, when I felt it go over a large piece of broken glass. Without hesitating, I grabbed it and stuck the thing in its eye. It let out a horrible cry and fell off me as I managed to sprint out of the house and into the boat. I could hear it crying that same mournful wail as I pushed the boat off and made it back to the cabin. I pulled in and tied the boat down before sprinting up to the house, but when I opened the door, I heard a horrible sound. The same crying was coming from somewhere inside my cabin. It sounded muffled at first, but grew in volume as I approached our bedroom. I made my way to the door, and as I opened it, the crying stopped. All I saw was Rachel slumbering peacefully the way I'd left her. I checked the closets, checked under the bed, checked every room in the house, but could find no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I dove under the covers and curled up tightly next to Rachel, my body trembling in terror. I decided right there we were leaving the following day. I couldn't be here anymore. I don't know if it was exhaustion or the result of high adrenaline wearing off, but I somehow found sleep after cowering under the covers for a while. I had a dream, though. It was me walking to the shore of the island. I could see our cabin in the distance, a small candle in the living room providing it enough light to be seen. However, I had no control over my movements. Whatever I was actually seeing through looked down at the water, dove in, and began swimming furiously toward the cabin. All the way I screamed for it to stop, but it only gained speed. It climbed onto the dock and sprinted at an unnatural speed, the earth seeming to shake underneath its feet. It opened the door of the cabin, slowing its pace, carefully making its way through the living room, then down the hall. It stopped and looked right at the bedroom door. It creaked open the door and walked inside. There I was, sleeping like a baby. I watched its disgusting, monstrous fingers slowly reach down towards me before violently grabbing me by the throat. I jolted awake and immediately shook Rachel up. "We have to go now." "What?" she replied in a groggy tone. "Just start packing. We're leaving right now." I rushed her into the car and hastily threw everything I could find before speeding down the unpaved road and away from the place. Rachel groggily asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't seem to answer. I felt as though I was in shock, and I couldn't get any words to come out. It was then that I remembered the video. I'd recorded it all. I pulled out my phone and handed it to Rachel. "Go through the videos. Watch the most recent one," I told her. "I don't understand what I'm looking at here," she said in an exhausted voice before handing me the phone after watching for a few minutes. "What? Please, babe, just watch it through," I pleaded with her. She mumbled something but was already asleep again. I didn't really care that she wouldn't see it now. I was just happy to be getting away from that place and back home. I stopped at a rest stop a few hours into the trip. The sun had just finished rising. After making a trip to the bathroom and grabbing a few sodas from a vending machine, I decided to take a look at the video myself. Either Rachel was just half asleep, or the video didn't come out clear like I'd hoped. I pulled open the video, and my heart sank. There was no house in front of me, just dense brush and a huge pile of bricks and wood, the remains of a home. I scrolled through 2 hours of footage of me just standing there, staring straight ahead at nothing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I scrolled through the video, and it was over 3 hours straight of me just standing there. I went to the end of the video before some movement finally caught my eye, because the end of the video consisted of me slowly pulling up my shirt, dragging a knife across my stomach, and grunting in pain, before I dropped the knife and sprinted back to the boat in a panic, making my way back to the cabin. For several hours of the drive, I just sat in silence, unable to comprehend what all had happened. Even when Rachel took over driving, I would not let myself fall asleep in fear of having another nightmare. I didn't want to tell her, and I hoped that she was too tired to even remember me showing it to her. After the long 17-hour drive was finally over, we started to unload our stuff from the car. Rachel was gathering up all of her things while I started to haul in the larger pieces of luggage into the home. I walked into the house and set down all the luggage I was carrying. I felt a sense of unease take over. The air was thick and heavy and the house was freezing cold. I reached for our doorknob to the bedroom and felt my heart sink. Just beyond the door, I could hear the faint sound of a woman sobbing.
The Witch Broom, submitted by Natasha's 23. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, my grandma used to have an antique shop, which my mother helped run. It was a cold and dark September day when my mom, grandma, sister, and myself went to a yard sale to help my grandma find new stuff for her shop. Among the items, my mom found something she thought she could use for when we could decorate her house for Halloween. It was a small broom decorated with Halloween colors, black and orange. It also had the creepiest ornament in the middle of the handle. It depicted an ugly old witch with a witch's hat on it. I remember I was so scared to even go near it, so you can imagine how afraid I was when my mom bought it. On another day, Sunday to be exact, my grandma asked my mom to run an errand. My grandma was in the store, along with my then 20-year-old sister who began teasing me with the witch broom. "She's going to get you and eat you up, Chanel," she said tauntingly. "Mama, make Keisha stop. She's being mean to me," I cried. Now, there were already incidents where my sister teased me with it before with the broom while I was in the car. This annoyed my mother to the point that she got out of the car, opened the trunk, and took the broom out of my sister's hand. She threw it out of the car and slammed the trunk door. "Wipe your tears away, baby. Mommy made everything better," she said in a calm voice. When my grandma came out of the shop, it got dark very quickly and there was lightning outside. We rushed to get my grandma home, but didn't have to go far because we all lived on the same street. Our house was on a corner, but Grandma and Grandpa's house was further down on a dead end. Before we turned the corner toward the direction of my grandma's house, I noticed something was on the second door of the house, the screen door, but I couldn't tell what it was, and I could not remember if my mom had hung up some decoration before we left that day. I just shrugged it off. I said goodbye to my grandma and we waved hi to Grandpa. We turned back to go straight home, and the wind picked up abruptly. We got out of the car and we had confused looks on our faces as we climbed the steps and got closer to that door. We couldn't believe our eyes when we got up to it. On the wooden door, behind the screen, was the witch's broom hanging perfectly on the wooden door. I was so scared that I almost soiled myself. We had that broom until we moved, after we had a garage sale when I was 14. I'm 31 now, and I still have strange and paranormal things happen to me almost every day. but because it's happened to me so much, I'm no longer scared now. But back in the day, before all of this happened, when I first saw that witch broom hanging there when I knew we had thrown it out, I was more scared than I have ever been.
Guadalajara Witch, from Silver Bullet 54. Witches are ingrained in the culture of Mexico. My friend Thomas has an uncle who is convinced that witches are real. He relayed a story to me that his uncle told him about an experience he had in his younger days. Thomas is Mexican, and so is his uncle, and I was convinced this story is true. In 1988, Thomas's uncle was exploring the city of Guadalajara in western Mexico with some friends. They'd reached a large cathedral with twin gold spires when one of them spotted a strange mark on the ground. They all gathered around it, and Thomas's uncle said, "That's a pentagram." His friends figured it was a kid who didn't know any better or teens just playing a prank. His uncle agreed, but felt uneasy the entire day after seeing that. That night, he was lying in bed when he suddenly saw this shadow cast over the wall. This shadow was tall and thin, and the head had a shape to it, as if it was wearing a pointed hat. He sat up, but as soon as he did, the shadow vanished. When he told his friends about it, they said it was just sleep paralysis, a hallucination. Even so, he figured that shadow was cast by something as real as him. He was so terrified, he slept in a motel for 3 nights straight, rather than the house of the friend he was staying with. The 5th day after this experience, he was talking to some locals about it, and one of them said, "See, that witch tried to spirit away my granddaughter once. Scared her off with some silver bullets and a cross. Haven't seen her since." He said that in such a solemn way, it didn't seem like a tall tale or rambling of someone who lost their mind. The other men all nodded too, and a young man said, "Did I hear Fernando mention a witch? Samuel and Ali saw her as well." His uncle figured that a corroboration like that held some weight. He decided he would not be scared by this witch. What happened the following night was a complete opposite effect. He and his friends went to the cathedral at about midnight, waiting for something to happen, although they weren't sure what exactly they were waiting for. It was slightly past 1 a.m. when they heard someone walking around and muttering. They all peeked from around a column and saw a wizened old woman. She was holding a weird book with a title in a foreign language that none of them could pronounce. She seemed to be waving her hand in a strange manner. In their eagerness to see more, one of them slipped and hit his knee on the ground. The woman's eyes snapped right over to them, and they all ran. They heard her chasing them, saying,
"My magic is my business. I shall curse you all. Curse you all."
They didn't know if she was serious or crazy, but they kept running until they reached a cantina. They looked back and saw the woman grinning and nodding. She pointed one crooked finger at all of them and mouthed,
"Stay away."
Was this woman a witch? Hard to say myself, but Thomas at his uncle is convinced that there is a witch in Guadalajara. Maybe she was psychotic. Either way, she was certainly dangerous. So I guess now Thomas and I no longer need to tell stories about the Pennsylvania witch of Ridley Creek. We have our own tale, the Witch of Guadalajara. Riverdale Road, from A Bedbug. This is my first time writing this story down. Not the first time I've told it. Currently, I'm 25, turning 26 in October, in the year of our Lord, Satan, 2021, and this story happened when I was around 17 or 18, living in Louisville, Colorado, just 5 minutes outside of Boulder. However, the story takes place near Brighton, if my memory serves me correctly, on an 11-mile stretch of road, infamously known as Riverdale Road. I first found out about this road from an old kinda ex, I guess, but she took me there in the middle of November, at like 3 in the afternoon. There was a tree that was kind of an optical illusion, and a legend has it a witch who lived there in the early 1900s was tied to the tree and burned alive. And the illusion there is the scorch mark. The scorch mark kind of looks like a woman in a dress, staring at you. It's pretty spooky. So fast forward about 6 to 7 months, and 2 of my friends, who I'll call W and L, and a girl I'll call K, were deciding what to do one night, and I suggested, let's go check out Riverdale Road and go ghost hunting. My friends were pretty into it. None of them were skeptical, and for reference later, my friend L was just recently released from jail, awaiting his next trial. This will be kind of important later on in the story. So we make the 45-minute drive to Riverdale Road and stop at the gas station to get drinks. It's around 7 or 8 p.m. at this point. I was incredibly skeptic of the entirety of the legend, and being curious, I began looking up the lore and history of the area. I found out about the numerous body dumping sites on the road, as well as the numerous amounts of car crashes. Speaking of, our first stop was a large memorial sign for all the kids who died from the 70s to 90s on that road. Tied around the sign were little stuffed teddy bears. We inspected them, thought it was sweet. I noticed they were tied around the waist and had blue ribbons around their necks. We get back in the car and drive, talking smack about the witch and antagonizing the restless spirits, all the while smashing some candy and coffee drinks. We were all alternative kids, so naturally we were blasting Dead and Buried by A Day to Remember, as well as Bring Me the Horizon, Dance Gavin Dance, Slaves of Mice and Men, etc. As I said before, I was reading the lore on the area, so naturally we made a few stops along the 11-mile stretch of road, which were supposedly haunted. The first stop was Joggers Hill. Some guy was hit by a car there and died. Now, supposedly, he haunts the area. As the driver never called in the incident, it was a hit and run. We walk up the short little pathway that reaches a smaller hill amongst like 3 or 4 buildings. It's really pretty at night, because the lights from the highway don't quite reach you, yet you can still see them. Kind of like really bright stars as you look down around you. On top of the hill was a bed, an empty 24-rack case of natty lights, and a stake, like the kind you'd use on a vampire or something. We kick around there, not really doing much. My friends are flirting and talking with Kay, and I'm kind of just enjoying the weather and everything, minding my own business. After about 5 minutes of being bored, we hop back in the car and drive to the next spot on our list. That's when the air got heavy. And when I say heavy, it was like there was a really nice breeze and suddenly it was just still, oddly still. We stayed in the car with the windows down, pulled over with the headlights on, pointing at the witch. Well, by which I mean the tree I mentioned back at the beginning of the story with the scorch mark. It was really creepy like that. All of us kind of just went silent together, after having just talked and joked and laughed for the past 5 minutes straight. The positive mood just stopped. It was like the tree was staring at us, like the scorch mark wasn't a scorch mark anymore. I know people talk a lot about shadow people and ghosts, but if you ever had sunspots, it was kind of like that, except I wasn't blinking. I didn't take my eyes off of it for a solid 6 minutes before we said, let's go to the end and come back. We take the car out of park and drive up the road. I'm still looking and reading about the area. My friends are talking again in the front seat. All of a sudden, in the dead of night at like darn near 10 o'clock, a dove flies over the car. I don't know if they're nocturnal, but it was super weird to see this bright white dove fly right over the hood of the car and up into thin air,
I can't remember for the life of me who said it, or if I read it, but I remember someone saying, if we see 3 white animals on this stretch of road, it means we should turn back. That's when someone else said, Josh, who's our Navajo friend, said red foxes are usually signs of good luck. I don't know how true that is, so correct me if that's wrong. Anyway, we make it to the end of the road. That's when I notice there's this car that has sickly green headlights with pitch black windows coming up behind us. It pulls out and passes us before speeding off into the night. At the time, I didn't think much of it besides sick lights. We get to the end of the road and stop back at the gas station. We grab more snacks. Kay pays for me since I was the poor kid in our friend group, and we get back to the car to head out. By then, it's 10 to 11 p.m., and we were all kind of feeling spooked, but I wasn't convinced this place was really haunted. Regardless, all in all, we were having a lot of fun. We drove back through, repeating all the same stops, but this time, things really got freaking weird. We got out and walked up to the sign, and all the teddy bears were tied around the throat, not the belly, like they were last time. And now, they appeared to be damp. That's when Kay walked up to me and whispered to me she had taken one of them last time. Weirded out, we get back in the car, but we begin to notice other really weird things all over the road. There was a big sign that said Riverdale Road, but there were 3 big gash marks down the middle of it that I swear weren't there before. There were broken trees. Well, the road and everything around it just generally looked a lot more torn apart. We make our way to Joggers Hill. We park the car, get out, then go back on top of the hill. You remember when I said we were listening to Dead and Buried by ADTR? Well, we started chanting the chorus, but instead of buried, we were chanting jogging. Pretty funny stuff. As we're starting to have a good time again, I turned around and I looked towards the car. I was shocked to see some guy in our back seat. The silhouette of a man's head, shoulders, and face, but no discerning features, right there. I stepped closer, and I'm just thinking, what is that? Who is that? My friends turned to look, but that's when W and L bolt back to the car. I waited for K, and we bolted too. L gets in the back seat with me, K and W are in the front seat, and I get this wild idea to fog up the windows. So we roll up the windows and begin to breathe on the side of them. W begins to drive the car, and L is looking at my window as we back out. We were startled to find 4 streaks across mine and his windows, separate and parallel to each other, like fingertips rubbing down the glass. Immediately, I got chills, and my heart began to pound. I laugh when I'm scared, so naturally I was beginning to laugh. So we make it to the witch tree again. The air is still, and it's warm as we all pile out of the car. We parked close to the tree so that we didn't have to run far in case some wild crap went down. As we're walking, another car with green headlights comes up at about 60 to 70 miles per hour and nearly hits W. He just screams something at the car, but it was long out of sight by then. Shaken, we walk up to the trees. Every time any of us tries to speak or yell, the trees begin to move really loudly, like a gust of wind would just shake the heck out of them. W turns to me to say something, but just says, "Yeah, I'm going back to the car." Hip to hip, W and K take off back to the car, leaving just L and I. The 2 of us debated about continuing on to go and talk to the scorched tree. But we were genuinely scared. But my friend had a trial coming up, and I had an idea. We both decided to try to beg for the witch's blessing or something like that. Keep in mind, I was young and dumb, and I was worried about my friend. As we talked to the tree, I don't remember feeling too great about it,
and I do remember wanting to run right then and there. It wasn't too encouraging that the 6'2" soon-to-be convict next to me was holding on to me for dear life. He was scared too. Then the trees began to shake loudly, and it was like the creek just behind the trees began to get louder, as if something was rising out of the water. And that's when we heard it, this laugh. A woman's laugh. It sounded like it was mocking us. The two of us ran for the car, getting in and freaking out. On the drive to the end of the road, W starts telling me why he left. He said, "I went to turn to U&L, but I saw these figures sitting in the tree, staring at you two. So I tried my best to ignore them and leave." On the way back, right before the gas station, we were all laughing and joking again, and I turned to my right. Kay and I see a white fox jumping out of the bushes, then disappearing. We kind of just gasped. Trust me, I'm the last person to ever gasp at anything. Things rarely surprise me, but that was straight up out of a horror film. We get back to the gas station. I get one more coffee. Then we stop at Walmart for a small break to walk around in a safe place. But we get back in the car for one last run. W and L in the front seat, K and I in the back. W drives up the road, and we don't really stop. At this point, we're just tempting the road to kill us, though. All of us were pretty depressed back then and kind of wanted to try our luck. You know, like tempting fate and all that. But we decided, screw it. What do any of us have to lose? So we didn't stop. That's when we see her, 10 feet tall, towering over us, this burned wedding dress flowing in the wind, almost pitch black, just watching us on the side of the road. Before we get a chance to react, our entire lane, just our lane, is hit with this cloud of black fog. We can't even see anything out of the front or back windows, but W is smart enough not to keep driving, and I'm glad he didn't, because at the end of the road is this big curve that drops off onto another highway. We were about 15 feet from flying right over it if he hadn't reacted quick enough. When the fog cleared, we took off out of there. On our way back, we were in between total silence and freaking out. Kay lay in my lap, shocked as I was, before she looks up out of her window, and both of us see her. The witch. I swear I saw her waving goodbye to us in that burned wedding dress. That's my first and one of my most terrifying stories. I've tried rationalizing it in so many ways, but I just can't. We weren't drunk or high, but even still, somehow I had one of the best times of my life that night. We stayed out and drove until 8 a.m. I found a bottle of Evan Williams and I got drunk off of it by myself. I remember later on, after Kay and I started going out, she tossed that old bear she had taken from the sign into the old apartment Elle and I lived at. She simply tossed it in the living room and it vanished completely. We never found it, even when we moved everything out. Ghost Witch of Oklahoma. From C. Philly 100. My aunt and uncle live in Oklahoma, so my brother and I grew up going out there to visit. We used to spend our summers out on the lake, water skiing, cliff jumping, and exploring the amazing state that is Oklahoma. For those of you who do not know, Oklahoma didn't become a state until 1907. Before that, it was the frontier and home to many Native American peoples and tribes. Today, Oklahoma is home to 39 tribal nations, and it just so happens my aunt is Native. She is a GS-15 with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Basically, she's in a top-level position. We grew up learning the legends and hearing stories, but I never figured we'd be in one. This actually happened when I was quite young, maybe 13 or so, which would make my brother 11 at the time. Still, I remember every detail like it was yesterday. We were out frog gigging, which is when you go out looking for bullfrogs along the shoreline of a lake with a 1,000,000 lumen flashlight and a boat. I'd never seen so much wildlife, and I grew up in Colorado. There were deer and frogs and snakes and beavers the size of small children. We'd been told that there might be an alligator in the lake too, but we never did see it. But we did see an owl so big it broke the branch it was sitting on when it took flight, and its wingspan was massive. So we were out there trolling around, nighttime, and my uncle and his friend decided to spook us with a legend of the lake. They told us that an old medicine man used to live by the lake, hunting and practicing his medicine in peace. Then one day the white man came, tricking the people into signing a peace treaty, which they later broke, stealing the land and sending the people to live on a reservation. The medicine man and his family refused to go to the reservation. The medicine man's family went to hide out at the lake with him. Well, one day while the medicine man was out hunting, some bandits discovered the camp and burned it to the ground, killing everyone there. When the medicine man returned to the camp, finding his whole family had been murdered, he was grief-stricken and vowed vengeance upon the White Devil and all his descendants. He turned to dark magic and witchcraft, using his animal bones to make special curses and spells. He practiced dark rites and rituals, which allowed him to become immortal, and though his body might die, his soul would go on living. However, he would have to continue killing in order to take on the skin of other animals to keep on existing. One day he went to kill a buffalo to take on its skin, but the buffalo was too strong, goring the man with his horn, carrying him off into the lake where they both drowned. That's how the legend went. Just then, something bumped up against the bottom of the boat. "What was that?" I whispered. Another bump. My brother and I both screamed then. My uncle and his friend began to laugh. My uncle's friend had hit the hull of the boat with his oar, causing us to freak out. "Classic," my uncle said. "Works every time." "But what about the medicine man?" my brother asked. "Well, to the best of my knowledge, that's all true," my uncle said. "Or that's the legend, anyway." Something bumped up against the boat again. Okay, I said. "That might have worked the first time, but we're not falling for it again." Silence. My uncle and his friend now exchanged nervous glances. Another bump. "Guys, come on, cut it out," my brother exclaimed. "That wasn't me," my uncle said. "Me neither," his friend admitted. That's when things began getting really weird. There was something in the water, something big. Just then, the tip of a horn broke through the surface of the water to our starboard side, followed by what looked to be a giant, rotting head. The eyes were all sunken in, the face bloated and discolored, and one of the horns was broken off, but it did appear to be the head of a cow or a buffalo. The head continued rising up out of the water until the spinal cord was exposed, followed by the skeletal remains of a disfigured human body. "Go, man, go!" my uncle shouted. His friend began yanking on the starter cord, but the engine would not fire. "Prime it!" "I'm trying to, but the engine is flooded." The thing started to swim towards us. Then we were hit with a smell like dead and rotten flesh. You could see that whatever this thing was had been dead for a very long time, and it was now covered in black tar-like grime. The skeleton on the back of the buffalo seemed to be propped up, but void of life. It wasn't moving, it was just staying on the back of the buffalo as it moved through the water. Finally, the engine fired up, and we started to throw up a small wake. My brother and I were seriously freaking out now. My uncle was scanning the water with the flashlight, but we could no longer see the thing. A thick mist formed on the surface of the lake. The night, which had formerly been alive with the sounds of insects and critters, was now ghastly silent, save for the sound of the small boat motor We got back to the dock and I tied the boat off before running to the car, getting the nope out of there. I don't know if my uncle's friend ever went back there to get his boat. I'm sure he did. As for us, we never went back to that lake again, and that was the last time we ever went frog gigging in Oklahoma. The Witch of Mount Edziza, from Gazebo King. My story begins outdoors. My friend Ricky and I enjoyed hikes through the woods. We always found it a great way to relax after the work week, and so every Saturday, we'd make the 30 or so kilometer drive to Mount Edziza. It's a beautiful national park in northwestern British Columbia, featuring a huge amount of woods that climb the gradual slopes of the mountain. That day was no different from our usual. We were working our way up a trail, occasionally photographing the natural scenery. Now, keep in mind this park is very isolated, as in it's in the middle of nowhere. It's a minimum hour drive from the nearest town, and the lack of accessibility led to it being one of British Columbia's less popular parks. Very rarely do you ever meet another person on the trails. That's why when my friend first mentioned it, I thought he was messing with me. I was bending down to tie my boot when Ricky quietly said, "Whoa," out loud. I look up. What is it? He glances at me before turning and searching up the path. I just saw some girl up there. Where? Up there. He pointed with his finger to the end of the visible trail. She was looking at us, and then she disappeared up the path. I was puzzled. What did she look like? I don't know. Barely saw her. I felt pretty strange after this. After all, it was late August. The weather was cloudy, and there was even a little bit of rain. We rarely saw people during peak hiking days, so it was extremely unlikely he actually saw a person that day. Despite that, Rick wasn't the type to lie for no reason, so I figured he really did see someone. We continued walking up the trail. As we neared where he said he saw the girl, we began to pick up on a smell. This smell was faint at first, gradually increasing the closer we got to the bend in the path. The best way I could describe it is a bouquet of flowers. If you ever spent time in a florist shop, you know what I mean. It was heavy and concentrated, like we just walked into a room filled with nothing but roses. Still though, something about it was off in some way. It was distracting, and it made me want to follow it. "Do you smell that?" I asked. "Yeah." Ricky inhaled deeply through his nose. "What is it?" I shook my head, not bothering to reply, because I really didn't know. We looked around, and despite how strong the smell was, we didn't see anything that could have been responsible for that peculiar odor. Now, the forest along the mountainside is lush and full of life, but it's predominantly trees. There are a few wildflowers, but there's no way the floral aroma should have been this strong. We stopped at the bend in the path to drink from our water bottles, sitting on a large fallen tree. There weren't any people or anything else out of the ordinary, aside from that strange smell. Eventually, we moved up the path again. After about 50 footfalls, the flower smell seemed to stay the same, more or less, no matter how far we walked. We worked our way through the rest of the hike pretty quickly, and yes, the flowery smell remained constant the entire time. We eventually theorized that some rare, extra stinky flower was in bloom on the mountainside, which served as explanation enough. A medium fog seemed to settle over the mountain, which wasn't anything new. As we walked, though, we began to realize something was off. I was the first one to notice. It felt as if I was being hit with a wave of deja vu. Hey Rick, does that tree look familiar? Ricky looked at me and followed my hand, seeing where I was pointing. Wait, didn't we pass that half an hour ago? Somehow, without being aware of it, we were back at the fallen tree we took a break at before. We followed the path the entire time and we knew it hadn't looped, so it wasn't possible we were back here. Seriously, what the heck? How did we get here? Rick seemed a little alarmed. I don't know, man. Should we just head back? Rick looked at me for a moment before nodding. I guess so, he whispered. Remember how the fallen tree was right at the peak of the path before it turned? That led us all the way down the hill, and so we should have been able to see approximately where we entered from. When we looked down the trail, though, preparing to head back, what we saw was unnerving. The path went down like it should, but right at the lowest point, where it should have swerved left into the opening of the woods, it went back up the hill again. It was like the entire forest was mirrored somehow. And at the very end of the hill, we could just make out two men standing there, wearing the exact same clothes as us. Dude, do you see that? I was already staring when Ricky frantically pointed towards the other peak, where our duplicates stood. We walked forward a little. What in the world? That's when we noticed that the man who was dressed exactly like Ricky seemed to move further away. Rather quickly, given the circumstances, we were able to comprehend that the people we saw were mirroring our movements, or perhaps we were mirroring theirs. My friend looked at me with his hands on his head. What do we do? I don't know, dude. Let's just try to get back. So, without another word, we started descending down the hill. As we did, the other pair of men seemed to go down their hill, and so they faded out of our view, much to our relief. Keep in mind, the smell of flowers was still so potent in the air. We finally got to the low point between the two slopes, and as we did, the rain picked up from a light drizzle to a heavy downpour. Let's hurry it up, I said. Ricky didn't respond. A rather brisk few minutes later, we were atop the hill, where we were once again greeted by the fallen tree. Both in front of us and behind us, the situation was the same. Reality seemed to be mirrored, and in both directions, we could see copies of ourselves sitting atop the hill just like we were. Ricky was starting to panic. Trying to be logical, I decided to get out my phone, preparing to document whatever in the world was going on. To my dismay, my device didn't turn on. It was a new, premium smartphone with an almost full battery, yet it was completely unresponsive. The screen just remained black as I pushed the power button. Try yours. Rick got out his phone, and it didn't work either. At this point, the sky was beginning to get dark, and the rain was pouring. It's not working. What the heck do we do, man? I shook my head. I had no idea. That's when we heard a voice.
Are you boys lost?
The voice was mature and feminine. It was well enunciated but coated in a thick accent. I'm not very good with dialects, but I'd guess it was European. We both turned, looking to the side of the path and into the woods. About 10 feet in front of us, seated casually on a stump, was a woman. But she was no ordinary woman. The moment I saw her, I felt as if I was intoxicated She was sitting, but we could tell she was tall, taller than either of us. She was slim but very toned. She had fair skin with no visible imperfections, and her hair was short and jet black. I can easily say she was the most beautiful person I'd ever seen. I inexplicably felt magnetized to her. Her outfit, though, that was the weirdest part of all. She wore a dress like one you'd expect to see at a party, and it was accessorized by a large black sun hat. Very strangely, her clothes showed no signs of being wet or weathered at all, despite us being in the middle of a storm. We both gazed at her in awe. She stood up, walking towards us.
Well?
She strutted, as if on a catwalk.
Are you or are you not?
Rick's tongue was completely tied. I managed to stammer out a few words, though. Yeah, we are. As she came close to us, it became suddenly apparent she was the source of the floral smell.
That isn't any good.
She turned away from us.
Lost on a mountain, especially in all this fog. That's just a recipe for trouble.
That's when we noticed that the fog, which was quite thin before, was suddenly very heavy. We couldn't see 10 feet in front of us. I nudged Ricky and whispered,
"Dude, is that who you saw before?"
He whispered in reply,
"Yeah, 100%.
She turned back around, looking at us, as if waiting for us to say something. She seemed to be evaluating us with her piercing blue eyes.
Well, come on then.
She waved her hand and began pacing down the mountain. We followed on command. Again, I can't explain it, but the woman was enchanting in a very unnatural way, and it left us practically helpless. It was only a few minutes before she stopped. The entire time, though, her dress didn't get any wetter from the rain. It was as if she had an invisible umbrella, dissipating the drops as they fell.
You can take it from here, I suppose.
She turned around to face us, and as she did, the fog thinned back to regular levels. That's when I realized that we were back at the start of the trail, only a few meters into the woods. The exit and the parking lot were visible. She moved to the side, allowing us to pass. We walked by, still in a trance. Before we exited the woods, though, I turned around. I wanted to thank her, or something. It's hard to explain, but I wanted to get one last look at her. When I turned around, though, she was gone. I didn't see how she could have gotten out of sight. It was like she just disappeared. I stood there, bewildered, searching up the mountain with my eyes and seeing no one. The only movement was raindrops. Ricky grabbed my shoulder. "Come on, man. Let's get out of here." Without another word, I followed him back to the SUV and we got in, him in the driver's seat. As we pulled away, though, I took one last glance in the rearview mirror, and just under the glow of the singular street lamp in the parking lot, I could see a silhouette of a woman waving goodbye. We never went back to that park again. That was actually one of our last hikes ever, with me and Ricky growing apart due to the void of misunderstanding the incident created. Recently he moved, and we lost touch entirely. I never saw that strange woman again. Upon researching this online, I've theorized that she was likely a witch or some sort of spirit.
Whether she created the mirroring effect in the forest and the extreme weather, I'm unsure. Regardless, I feel indebted to her, as she did save us. There's one last thing I'd like to mention, though. Whenever it rains at night, and it does a lot in the interior of British Columbia, I have the same dream. The exact same one, consistently, and I've had it ever since the event. Ricky and I are always on a hike of sorts. It goes normally, with nothing weird happening. Whenever we leave, though, I always check the rearview mirror of the car, and I see that woman waving at us.
The Strageria Experience, submitted by Adam Flowers. I'm a biologist, and as such, I place a lot of weight on evidence. I try to ignore eyewitness accounts and anecdotal experiences. To me, the word paranormal is a misnomer. There are simply things we don't understand yet. I also have to admit that I use cannabis frequently, but not for fun, but as directed by my physician. As such, I don't really use any strains that are strong enough to affect me in any other way than relieving pain and allowing me good sleep. I've been doing it for 2 years now, and I've never had an experience like I did only 2 nights ago. We live in Southern California. We recently moved to a beach city. Our new home is being remodeled, so we're staying in another home my family owns temporarily. My family only purchased this home a month back, and they haven't moved in or began to work on it just yet. From the very outset, the house oozed with darkness and just straight up weird floor plans that get you lost, doors that go to nowhere, a secret entrance in the garage, and a bonus room that's only 10 by 10 with a skylight and 2 padlocks. I decided to lock that room and never go in it. Besides, it's going to be demolished soon anyway. There were mirrors everywhere, and this really creeped out my wife. They look like the mirrors from that horror film Oculus, but much smaller. There were about 10 in that room altogether. I removed them and put them in the garage, except for the largest, which was bolted into the wall, and I have no tools with me that can undo it. Once we got settled, I began to check out the bedrooms, and it only got weirder from there. 2 of the bedrooms had windows, but these windows don't go outside. They were one-way mirrors into other rooms in the home, including that creepy 10 by 10 room. I decided not to tell my wife about this, so I suggested that we put our air mattress in the living room for the time being. She didn't question it, as our furniture was in storage, and there was no furniture in the home. She just assumed that I wanted to watch the large television that we had in the room. That night, we went to bed just fine, actually being thrilled that we moved in and had an ocean view. I pushed the creepiness out of my mind as stress from the move. I dismissed the house's odd design, and I chalked it up to the original owners, who built the home in 1966. I told myself that they were just really bad at home improvements, but that was lying to myself, to be honest. I woke up the next morning, and that's when things began to get bad. As I walked down the hallway, the large mirror there caught my attention. I looked, and at the top of it, the past owners had carved their names into the mirror. It wrote, "Enjoy your new home, from Mr. and Mrs. Let's call them Pizza." I'm not being derogatory or funny, but it's the first thing that comes to mind about the previous owners. That's because when we moved in, they had left behind 4 industrial-sized pizza ovens. This was even weirder, because I was told they were just hermits who kept to themselves. Anyway, I had tried to get that mirror down the day before for at least 10 minutes straight, and I have to be honest with you, the carving wasn't there that day. But still in denial, I ignored it, telling myself I was just stressed, that it had to have been there the day before and I just didn't see it. But deep down, I was shaken. I knew I was wrong. On one sunny day, we decided we needed to get out of the house. We're 6 blocks from the beach after all. We didn't move to a beach city to just sit inside all day. So as we got ready to go, we walked our new puppy and left him loose in one of the bedrooms. I felt he was old enough to be on his own without an accident, and I wasn't ready exactly to give him free reign of a new house, as huskies are known to be escape artists. Well, we went out, and we had a great time. Later on that day, when we arrived home, the first thing I noticed was that the puppy was crying. I ran to the bedroom to let him out, but the bedroom was now locked from the inside. I put my ear to the door because I thought I heard something. As I did, I heard whispering, but it wasn't loud enough to make out. I was afraid that someone had broken in, that they'd locked themselves in that room trying to steal our dog when they heard us pull up. So I did what I thought I had to. I kicked the door in. That door was going to get replaced anyway. So I barged in, and it was pitch black in the room. Though it shouldn't have been, because I play a TV in the background with nature noises to calm the dog while we're not home. I turned on the light to the room, and there was no one there, not even my dog. I began to panic when I heard him crying again, but now it was from another room, not the one I put him in, and there was no way he did this on his own. I found him locked in that creepy 10 by 10 room. Completely thrown for a loop, I let him out, and I was assuming someone was screwing with us and changing our locks. I just couldn't understand what was really happening. I went to lay down on the air mattress to de-stress with some guilty pleasure TV that wouldn't engage me intellectually too much. That evening, I couldn't leave the house. There was a technician on his way to install Wi-Fi, which we desperately needed, as there are times in this city where you can't even get a weak signal on your cell phone. Soon enough, the installation appointment window came and passed, yet there was no sign of the technician. I'm patient, so I waited another hour and a half before finally calling the company. By this time, it was dark out. They said that there was an unforeseen issue, that they couldn't install it today, so they'd be there first thing in the morning. I was irritated, but that was fine. That night, we rested pretty easily, falling asleep quickly, until about 3 in the morning, when I heard a large rumbling growl. It's the only way I can describe this noise, but not like you'd hear from a dog. This was something else. No matter what, this was odd, because in an overcrowded beach city, there really wasn't much in the way of wildlife, save for what's underwater. As I lay there listening to this noise, the next thing I heard was a shattering, and of course, it was coming from the 10 by 10 room. I shot out of bed, completely ready to finally confront this person who's been screwing with us. I ran into the room, and of course, there was no one inside. I looked at that one-way mirror that went into the next bedroom. From this side, you could only see your own reflection, but it was mostly shattered. I walked over to inspect it, and I found a bullet hole. It was an exit bullet. I'm sure of it because I've grown up with firearms my entire life. My dad was a cop. I don't think anyone else heard it, which is extremely weird because land is a premium here and our neighbors are less than 20 feet away. So there was really nothing I could do but lock the doors again and go back to bed. I didn't tell my wife what I saw. I was trying to push the thought out of my head altogether. The morning came and the internet service technician was finally here. I opened the door, and he looked absolutely horrified and seemed like he didn't want to come inside. When he actually saw me, though, he instantly relaxed. He smiled like we were brothers or something who hadn't seen each other in years. He said he was happy to see me, assuming he was just being polite so that he'd get a good review if we did one. But he continued at how relieved he was to see a normal person in this house. Curious, I asked him what he meant. He told me that most of the people in the neighborhood were afraid of this house. He told me that the neighborhood was initially settled by Italian immigrants, and the previous owners fit that group. He said that a woman who had lived here was regarded as a practitioner of Strageria. I'd never heard this before, but he told me it was an ancient form of mysticism. Apparently it had Catholic roots. The closest English definition would be witchcraft. Being the cynical biologist that I was, I laughed, thanking him for coming, and he left. I went into one of the spare bedrooms because we left our luggage in there, and I didn't think it necessary to move it just yet, as I was and still am skeptical for the most part. I only say most part because of what happened next. The closet door in the room was open, and it was an extremely heavy wooden sliding door, and I was the only person with the strength to move it, and that was only just barely. There was a box of photos in there, and stupidly I decided to take a look. Almost all of them were of the previous owner and her dog, and my first thought was, she didn't look creepy. She looked happy and normal. I put the pictures away and went back to my business. Time once again came for bed, and I was pretty stressed, so I went outside to smoke a little pot first, so I could chill out and fall asleep better. The marine layer, or a big body of fog, had rolled in, and visibility in front of me was only about 10 feet, and it was pretty cold that night. But then again, we're spoiled here, so cold to us might be pretty warm to others. I sat outside and began to get my things ready to smoke. My wife came outside with me and we talked. It was extremely barren outside. There were no cars or people on the street, and it was almost completely silent, except for the sound of a barking dog almost 2 blocks away. My wife went inside, and I went back to the edge of the yard where I smoke. That way it doesn't go into any of the neighbors' windows. In this section of the yard, I would perch on the ledge, which normally gave you a beautiful view of the harbor lights, but with the fog, there was no luck with that. Oh well, I thought, and was about to light up, when an extremely frail Caucasian woman, an extremely old one at that, came around the corner, walking her dog. My mouth hung open, because that was the same dog I'd seen in those photos from the box in the room. Lots of people like small dogs, I thought. In this part of town, they were almost an accessory. Maybe it just looked exactly like it. She walked by very slowly, deliberately slower than what would be considered normal for someone of even her age. She walked past me and stopped at the neighbor's driveway. She faced away from it, looking at the harbor, which was again odd because you couldn't see anything. So to me, it looked like she was just staring into the fog. She did this for 10 minutes straight, not moving. I assumed she hadn't noticed me. Then she began to turn her head back and forth quickly, in an unnatural jerking motion, as if she was paranoid about being attacked at any moment. I once more did something incredibly stupid. I jumped down from my perch, said, "Hello, ma'am," and asked her if she needed help. I even invited her inside where it's warm. She said nothing, but jerked her head once more, finally fixating it on me. Her face was extremely grimaced, as if she was indignant. Not just normally angry, but ready to fight angry. I started to walk closer towards her. I couldn't make out all of her details completely from this distance. I had no fear though. I'm 185 centimeters and about 112 kilograms, and she looked to be less than half my weight. Even still, she took a step towards me and came into view. Immediately, I was terrified, and my heart rate instantly spiked higher than I've ever felt it. Because that was the same woman from the photos, Mrs. Pizza as I called her. She was pale, paler than normal, and she smelled like rotting fish. This woman was soaking wet all over, but the worst part was that her eyes were red. Not just the pupil, but her entire eyes. I screamed like a small child, and I jumped back, taking a defensive posture, ready to fight until the death. She then smiled and took a step back, fading into the thick fog. I decided I didn't need to sleep that night, as I was pretty horrified at this point, and I didn't want to smoke to the point that I'd fall asleep. I didn't feel safe. I guess you could say I wasn't ready to be unconscious just yet. I called my mom the next morning, and I told her she needed to move up the demolition date of the house. I'm not sure if that will be the end of it. I don't have a concrete answer for my experiences either. Rational or not, my peace of mind is worth more. So from here on out, we'll be staying at an extended stay hotel until our place is ready. And from this day onward, I hope I never see that scary red-eyed Italian witch ever again.
Thank you for listening to another unsettling episode of Unexplained Encounters. You can send us your story to have it narrated on the show at darkstories.org. Unexplained Encounters is an EerieCast original series. You can find other horror-themed podcasts at eeriecast.com, such as Redwood Bureau, a fictional anthology series, Freaky Folklore, a documentary-style series about myths and cryptids around the world, Destination Terror, a show about the most haunted places, and Tales from the Break Room, another show I host all about the scary things that happen to people at work. Again, that's eeriecast.com. By the way, if you want fewer annoying ads and you want to support what we do, consider going to eeriecast.com/plus to sign up for EerieCast Plus. That unlocks all our podcasts with all but host-read ads removed. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.